What would you do if you lived in a time when entire parts of the world were still unknown on the maps? Would you have the courage to set sail and travel into the unknown? Write me directly in the comments. Would you have become an explorer yourself? Yes or no, and why? And before we start, if history fascinates you and you want to discover more exciting topics from the past, then leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss another video. Today we travel back to one of the most exciting epochs in human history, the Age of Discovery. It was a time full of adventure, curiosity, and groundbreaking travel. But behind the great expeditions were not only glory and the desire to explore, but also conquest, violence, and profound changes for entire continents and peoples. How did it come about that European seafarers suddenly set out to find new routes across the oceans? What consequences did their travels have for the world? And why does this epoch still have an impact today? That's exactly what we're looking at together now. Chapter 1. Introduction. What was the Age of Discovery? When people talk about the Age of Discovery, many people immediately think of large sailing ships, brave seafarers, unknown coasts, and the moment when people believed they had found a new world. These pictures do indeed belong to that era, but they only show part of the story. The Age of Discovery was much more than a series of spectacular voyages across the Atlantic or Indian Oceans. It was a profound time of upheaval, in which people's understanding of the world, of power, of trade, and even of themselves changed fundamentally. In general, the Age of Discovery refers to the period between the 15th and 17th centuries, when European powers began to systematically navigate the oceans, explore new sea routes, and incorporate increasingly distant regions of the Earth into their areas of trade and dominion. Portugal and Spain in particular were at the beginning of this development, followed later by England, France, and the Netherlands. But although this era is told in many depictions as a story of heroism and adventure, you have to take a closer look. For it was at the same time a time of awakening and violence, of gaining knowledge and destruction, of encounters between cultures and the subjugation of entire societies. In order to understand what the Age of Discoveries really was, one must first realize that the world was of course not first discovered by European seafarers. The continents, islands, and empires that Europeans encountered had long been inhabited. People with their own languages, religions, political orders, trade networks, and scientific knowledge lived there. So when European reports said they had discovered new countries, it usually only meant that these countries were new to Europe. For the local people, of course, they have been home for centuries or even millennia. This point alone shows that the term discovery is not neutral. Above all, it reflects the European perspective. Nevertheless, this epoch marks a decisive turning point in history. Before the Age of Discovery, many regions of the world were already connected by trade routes, but these connections mostly ran overland or along well-known coasts. There has long been an exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Silk, spices, gold, and knowledge made their way from one part of the world to another in different ways. Arab, Indian, Chinese, and African traders played a central role in this. So Europe was by no means the center of the world, but rather part of a larger network. This is precisely why European rulers and merchants were looking for ways to gain direct access to coveted goods without being dependent on middlemen. So the Age of Discovery did not come about out of pure curiosity alone. It was closely linked to economic and political interests. Spices such as pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were extremely valuable in Europe. They were not only used to flavor food, but were also considered remedies and status symbols. Whoever controlled these goods could make enormous profits. After the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453, access to important trade routes became more difficult and expensive for many Europeans. This strengthened the desire to find new routes to Asia. In particular, a direct sea route to India and the Spice Islands became a major goal. In addition to economic motives, the idea of power also played an important role. In Europe, increasingly centralized states with ambitious monarchs emerged who wanted to expand their influence. Those who found new territories could gain wealth, resources, and prestige. Seafaring was therefore often financed by kings or princes. They hoped for new trade opportunities, gold and silver, and an advantage over competing powers. Voyages of discovery have therefore always been political projects. Behind the sails and maps were the interests of domination, rivalries, and the pursuit of greatness. Religion was another important driving force. Many European rulers and seafarers also saw their journeys as a Christian mission. They wanted to spread the faith, find allies against Muslim powers, or convert people they considered pagans. In Spain and Portugal in particular, religious zeal and imperial ambition were very much mixed. After the Reconquista, i.e. the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, the idea was widespread that Christianity had to be expanded further. Mission, trade, and conquest therefore often went hand in hand. The fact that these trips became possible at all was also due to technical advances. Europeans did not reinvent seafaring, but they improved certain techniques and combined knowledge from different cultures. Ship types such as the caravel were faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to long journeys. The compass, the astrolabe, and more accurate maps helped with navigation. In addition, seafarers gained new experience about currents, winds, and coastlines with each expedition. The knowledge grew step by step. The voyages of discovery were therefore not only the result of courage, but also of learning, technique, and preparation. Portugal in particular played a pioneering role in the early stages. Portuguese seafarers felt their way further and further south along the West African coast. They were looking for new trade opportunities, especially with gold and later with enslaved people, and hoped for the sea route to India. A decisive moment was the circumnavigation of the Cape of Good Hope by Bartholomew Dias in 1488. This made it clear that the Indian Ocean was accessible by sea from Europe. A few years later, Vasco da Gama actually succeeded in making the journey to India. Portugal gained access to lucrative trade routes and established bases along the African and Asian coasts. Spain initially pursued a different path. Instead of circumnavigating Africa, Christopher Columbus relied on the idea of reaching Asia by driving west. When he crossed the Atlantic in 1492 with several ships, he believed he had found a western way to India. In fact, he landed in the Caribbean, a continent that Europe had not known in this context until then. The consequences of this trip were enormous. It led to further expeditions, the rapid expansion of Spanish claims in America, and to a process that permanently changed the world. With the voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and many others, a new phase of global interdependence began. Continents that had previously been only loosely connected or not at all were now integrated into a new system of exchange. Goods, plants, animals, people, diseases, and ideas moved across the oceans to an unprecedented extent. In this context, historians often speak of the beginning of early globalization. This means that the world did not suddenly become small, but that regions became more and more dependent on each other. Events in Europe could have an impact in America, Africa, or Asia, and vice versa. But it was precisely this global exchange that had dramatic consequences. Because the Age of Discovery was not only the history of new maps and trade routes, it was also the story of conquest, exploitation, and enslavement. When European powers gained a foothold in America, they subjugated entire empires and destroyed established societies. The arrival of the Europeans brought diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and other infections led to a massive population decline in many regions. At the same time, people were forced to do forced labor, land was expropriated, and traditional ways of life were forcibly suppressed. Africa has also been profoundly changed by this development. The transatlantic slave trade, which expanded more and more over time, deported millions of Africans to America. There they had to work under cruel conditions on plantations, in mines, and in households. This trade was a central element of the emerging global economic system. The wealth that arose in Europe through colonial trade and exploitation was based to a considerable extent on human suffering. The Age of Discovery therefore brought not only progress and knowledge, but also injustice on a massive scale. Despite all this violence, the era also changed people's thinking. The image of the Earth became more accurate, old ideas were questioned, and new scientific questions emerged. Maps had to be redrawn. Reports from seafarers, missionaries, and scholars expanded European knowledge of geography, plants, animals, and cultures. The idea of the world as a limited, manageable space was replaced by an experience of vastness, diversity, and complexity. This development influenced not only geography, but also philosophy, natural history, and politics. This is precisely why the Age of Discovery is so contradictory. It was an era of amazement and conquest at the same time. On the one hand, people dared to travel into the unknown, expanding knowledge and creating new connections between continents. On the other hand, this often happened under conditions of violence, arrogance, and domination. Many European actors do not regard other peoples as equals, but as people who are allowed to be disposed of. This gave rise to a colonial way of thinking, the consequences of which reach far beyond the epoch itself. Even today, these historical power relations shape global inequalities, cultural conflicts, and political debates. Therefore, as we look back at the Age of Discovery today, we should not fall into mere admiration or simple condemnation. Neither would do justice to historical reality. Rather, it is about understanding the complexity of this era. The Great Sea Voyages were part of a profound change in which Europe began to expand its influence worldwide. This process brought forth new knowledge, trade relations, and worldviews, but also oppression, colonialism, and a long shadow to the present day. So the Age of Discovery was not simply a time when a few brave men found new lands. It was the beginning of a new world order. Oceans became transport routes, continents were more closely connected, and distant regions were forced into common economic and political processes. For Europe, this meant growth of power and wealth. For many other societies, it meant loss, destruction, and foreign domination. It is precisely in this tension that the historical significance of the epoch lies. Anyone who wants to understand this time must therefore always see both sides: the urge for knowledge and the will to rule, the fascination of the unknown and the brutality of conquest, the broadening of horizons and the narrowing of human freedom for millions. The Age of Discovery is therefore still a key chapter in world history today. It explains how the modern globally networked world could emerge, and at the same time why this world is characterized by so many inequalities and historical wounds. This marks the beginning of our journey into an era that has permanently changed the history of mankind. In the following chapters, we will examine why Europe set out in the first place, what technical and political conditions made these developments possible, who the most important actors were, and what consequences their journeys had for the world. Because only when you know the background, goals, and consequences of these discoveries do you realize that it is not just a story of ships and maps, but the story of a global upheaval whose effects are still felt today. Chapter 2: Europe before the Great Journeys. Before European seafarers crossed the Atlantic, sailed along the coasts of Africa, or sought a sea route to India, Europe was a continent in transition. The Age of Discovery didn't suddenly come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long development that profoundly changed Europe politically, economically, religiously, and spiritually. If you want to understand why the great journeys began in the first place, you first have to take a look at the world from which they emerged. Because the men who later set off into the unknown on ships did not live in an empty historical stage. They were part of a society marked by crises, hopes, competition, and new opportunities. In the late Middle Ages, Europe was by no means the undisputed center of the world. On the contrary, compared to the highly developed empires of Asia or the far-reaching trade networks in the Arab world, Europe seemed in many respects rather fragmented and backward. There was no unified political order, no central power dominating the entire continent, and no direct access to the most valuable goods of world trade. Europe consisted of many kingdoms, principalities, city-states, and dominions, which often competed with each other. This political fragmentation led to conflicts on the one hand, but also to constant competition on the other. Rulers wanted to expand their power, secure wealth, and increase their influence. It was precisely this competition that would later play an important role in promoting voyages of discovery. The everyday life of most people in Europe was still strongly influenced by agriculture. The vast majority of the population lived in the countryside and worked in agriculture, often under harsh conditions. Life depended on harvests, weather, and taxes to landlords or church institutions. Famines were not uncommon, nor were social tensions. At the same time, however, cities grew in many regions. Particularly in Italy, the Netherlands, the Iberian Peninsula, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, economically important centers emerged in which trade, crafts, and the money economy became increasingly important. Merchants, bankers, and urban elites gained influence. So Europe was not just an agrarian continent, but was in a slow but noticeable transition. A decisive factor for this development was trade. Even though Europe did not have direct access to many coveted goods, it had long been involved in international trade relations. Goods from Asia and Africa reached Europe by land and sea. These included spices, silk, gemstones, sugar, perfumes, and other luxury goods. Spices in particular were in great demand, because they were not only considered a means of refining dishes, but also a sign of prosperity and useful remedies. However, the journey of these goods was long and costly. They usually reached Europe via several intermediaries. Traders from the Middle East, North Africa, and Italian cities such as Venice or Genoa controlled large parts of this trade. As a result, prices rose, and many European rulers and merchants looked for ways to circumvent these intermediate stages. At the same time, Europe was shaped by deep religious ideas. The Christian Church played a central role in people's lives. It not only determined religious questions, but also influenced politics, education, morality, and the worldview. Everyday life was characterized by Christian festivals, commandments, and ideas about the right life. Many people saw the world through a religious framework in which God determined the fate of mankind, and the earth was part of a divine order. The Church had great wealth, its own jurisdiction, and considerable political influence. But despite her power, she was not without controversy. There were tensions within the Church, reform efforts, and criticism of corruption and abuse of power. This religious imprint of Europe is important because it explains why later voyages of discovery were often justified not only by economic but also by missionary motives. In addition to religion, crises also shaped Europe in the late Middle Ages. One of the most serious disasters was the plague of the 14th century, which became known as the Black Death. It killed a large part of the population in many regions and left deep traces in society, the economy, and thought. Entire villages were depopulated, labor became scarce, social orders began to falter. Wars also burdened many regions of Europe. The 100 Years' War between England and France, internal power struggles, dynastic conflicts, and regional feuds caused uncertainty. But paradoxically, these crises also led to changes in the long term. In some areas, living conditions for survivors improved after the massive population decline because land and work were distributed differently. Cities were able to grow, wages rose in some cases, and new economic structures developed. Politically, Europe also began to change during this time. From the coexistence of many feudal rulers, more centralized monarchies developed in some regions. Especially in Portugal, Spain, England, and France, kings gained power and expanded administrations, tax systems, and military structures. This development was decisive because great voyages of discovery were expensive. They required ships, crews, equipment, provisions, and organizational planning. Such undertakings could only be carried out permanently if rulers were willing to provide money and political support. The emergence of stronger states was therefore an important prerequisite for expansion across the seas. Especially on the Iberian Peninsula, i.e. in today's Spain and Portugal, conditions developed that favored the later beginning of the Age of Discovery. For centuries, this region was marked by the conflict between Christian and Muslim rulers. Since the early Middle Ages, Muslim empires had ruled large parts of the peninsula, and Christian kingdoms in the north led a long process of reconquest, the so-called Reconquista. This movement was not only militarily, but also religiously charged. It shaped a climate in which struggle, expansion, and Christian mission were closely linked. As the Christian empires reconquered ever larger areas, their self-confidence also grew. Portugal in particular, and later Castile and Aragon, which developed into the core of what would later become Spain, were increasingly able to direct their forces outwards. Portugal occupied a special position in this regard. The country was located on the edge of Europe, with direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. While other powers were more oriented to the east or remained embroiled in intracontinental conflicts, Portugal's geographical location provided a natural link to the sea. The Atlantic was not only a border, but also an opportunity. Portuguese sailors and rulers began to take an interest in the West African coast early on. Gold, trade contacts, and the hope of finding new routes to the east beckoned there. The Atlantic coast thus became a testing area in which maritime experience could be gained. But Europe before the great journeys was not only characterized by power politics and religion, but also by intellectual changes. In the late Middle Ages, and especially in the Renaissance, thinking began to change in parts of Europe. Old texts from antiquity were rediscovered. Scientific questions were asked anew, and interest in nature, geography, and man himself was strengthened. In the Italian cities, a new educational ideal developed, which no longer saw man only as part of a divine order, but also emphasized his ability to know and shape. This intellectual movement did not immediately reach all parts of Europe, but it influenced the climate in which curiosity, observation, and thirst for knowledge could grow. This was also associated with a stronger preoccupation with the world as a geographical space. Maps were improved, travel reports were collected, and knowledge from antiquity, from the Arab world and from the practical experience of merchants and seafarers was combined. Of course, people knew even before Columbus that the Earth was spherical, at least formed circles in Europe. But there was great uncertainty about how large it was, how the continents were distributed, and which routes across the sea were actually possible. In this mixture of knowledge and error, of experience and speculation, the intellectual background for later expeditions emerged. Another important aspect was the economic change within Europe. In the cities, a money economy increasingly developed. Trade became more extensive, credit and banks gained in importance, especially in Italian trading centers. Rich merchant families financed enterprises, invested in goods, and influenced politics. This economic dynamism created not only new opportunities, but also new needs. Anyone who wanted to trade needed safe routes, reliable information, and access to raw materials. Europe began to think beyond its previous borders, because wealth and power were increasingly linked to long-distance trade. At the same time, however, Europe was also shaped by ideas of the foreign and unknown, which were often permeated by myths, fears, and inaccurate reports. For many people, the known world ended at the edges of what could be experienced. Stories of rich empires, wonderful landscapes, dangerous creatures, and foreign peoples circulated across distant regions. Such ideas were partly imaginative, partly based on real reports. Travel stories such as Marco Polo's had increased European interest in Asia. It was believed that there would be immeasurable wealth, powerful rulers, and trade opportunities that could open up new opportunities for Europe. The image of the distance was therefore a mixture of hope, greed, and amazement. It should also not be overlooked that Europe learned during this time to adopt and further develop maritime knowledge from other cultures. Much of what made later voyages of discovery possible was based on knowledge that had not only been created in Europe. The compass originally came from China. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge was imparted via the Islamic world, and cartography and navigation also benefited from exchange across cultural borders. Europe was therefore by no means an isolated genius, but part of a larger stream of knowledge transfer. Europe's ability has often been to pool existing knowledge in a practical way, use it for its own purposes, and embed it in new political projects. Before the great voyages, Europe was therefore a continent of contrasts. There was poverty and growing wealth, deep religiosity and cautious spiritual renewal, political fragmentation, and at the same time the emergence of powerful kingdoms. Old feudal structures persisted, while more modern forms of economy were already emerging in the cities. People lived in a world that seemed familiar to them, but at the same time was full of tensions. Many developments pushed for change: the desire for direct access to luxury goods, the striving for power, competition between rulers, the search for new sources of income, and the growing self-confidence of maritime states. It was precisely the combination of these factors that made the departure possible. If there had only been curiosity, but no political means, the big trips would hardly have come about. If there had been only economic interests, but no technical possibilities, they might have failed. If there had only been strong faith, but no competition between states, the urge to expand would have been less great. It was only the interplay of economic ambition, religious ideas, political competition, technical learning, and geographical location that created the ground for what was later called the Age of Discovery. So Europe was on a threshold. It was not yet a globally dominant continent, but it developed forces that would soon reach far beyond its previous borders. Especially on the coasts of the Atlantic, the view began to change. The sea was no longer just a threat or a marginal zone, but a space of possibility. Beyond the horizon, wealth, trade routes, alliances, and perhaps fame were suspected. This idea gave a special dynamic to the following undertakings. The departure by sea was not only a technical or geographical achievement, but an expression of a Europe that was beginning to redefine itself. So when we ask about the origins of the Age of Discovery, the answer does not lie solely in the ships of the later seafarers. It lies in Europe before these journeys, in its cities and ports, in the courts of kings, in the workshops of mapmakers, in the offices of merchants, in churches, in the conflicts of states, and in the longings of a society that was at once limited and ambitious. Europe before the great voyages was a world that was still strongly rooted in the Middle Ages, but already had the forces within it that were to usher in the modern era. Thus, the history of the Age of Discovery begins not only with Columbus or Vasco da Gama, but with a continent in upheaval. Europe was looking for new ways because its old ways had become limited, expensive, or politically uncertain. It sought wealth, influence, and divine validation. And it gradually had the means to pursue these goals at sea. It was precisely from this starting point that the urge to cross the known boundaries arose. The great voyages were thus not the beginning of history, but the consequence of a development that drove Europe step by step out onto the Atlantic. Chapter 3: The Motives of the Explorers: Gold, God, and Glory. Why did European seafarers set out on dangerous journeys in the 15th and 16th centuries, hardly knowing what awaited them beyond the horizon? Why did men like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, or Ferdinand Magellan risk their lives on stormy seas, far from safe shores, threatened by hunger, disease, shipwreck, and unknown opponents? The answer to this question is complex, because the Age of Discovery was not driven by a single drive. Rather, there were several forces that worked together and reinforced each other. Three major motives are often spoken of in this context: gold, God, and fame. These three terms succinctly summarize what moved many people at that time. But behind them lies a whole web of economic interests, religious convictions, political ambition, and personal hope. The motif of gold stands first and foremost for the desire for wealth. For many rulers, merchants, and adventurers, the thought of crossing the sea to unimagined treasures was tempting. In Europe, gold was not only a precious metal, but a symbol of power, security, and prestige. Those who owned gold could finance wars, trade, build palaces, and increase their political influence. Gold, therefore, meant more than mere luxury. It was the basis of rule and economic strength. At a time when states were expanding their power and competing with each other, access to wealth was of central importance. But when we talk about gold, we don't just mean the metal itself. The term also stands for economic gains in general. European powers were looking for new trade routes because they wanted to reduce their dependence on existing trade networks. Spices, silk, precious stones, ivory, and other precious goods came to Europe from Asia and Africa, but mostly through many intermediaries. This made these goods expensive and unsafely available. The spice trade in particular was extremely lucrative. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg and cinnamon were coveted in Europe and could be sold at high prices. Those who found direct access to these markets could make huge profits. Therefore, the dream of wealth was not only tied to mythical gold countries, but also to trade controls, monopolies, and new economic opportunities. Many explorers were therefore not sent out simply out of a thirst for adventure, but because their ventures were seen as investments. Rulers, bankers, and merchants wanted to see profits. A sea voyage was expensive. Ships had to be built or equipped, crews had to be paid, supplies had to be procured, and weapons had to be carried. No one invested such sums without hope of return. Even where reports spoke of discovery, research, or divine providence, very tangible economic interests were often in the background. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans became areas of profit in which new paths to ancient riches or completely new resources were to be developed. For individual seafarers, the prospect of prosperity was also decisive. Many of them did not come from a highest strata of the nobility, but from families who wanted to rise through trade, military service, or administration. A successful expedition could significantly improve the social rank. Anyone who found new territories, concluded trade treaties, or brought home treasures could hope for rewards, titles, land, or offices. So the Age of Discovery also offered an opportunity for personal advancement. Men who might have had few opportunities in the old order saw in the sea a way to make a name for themselves and change their own position. But wealth alone does not explain the whole dynamic of this era. Equally important was the motive of God. In the late Middle Ages and early modern period, Europe was deeply religious. Most people understood their lives as part of a divine order. The Christian faith influenced not only personal thinking, but also politics, law, and war. Rulers often saw themselves as appointed by God, and military successes could be interpreted as an expression of divine grace. In this climate, it was obvious to interpret the voyages of discovery in religious terms. Many expeditions were understood not only as economic undertakings, but also as Christian missions. This religious dimension was particularly pronounced in Spain and Portugal. Both countries were marked by the long conflict with Muslim rulers on the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista had created a consciousness in which expansion and the defense of the faith were closely linked. As the Christian kingdoms on the peninsula grew stronger, this missionary and militant zeal was increasingly directed outward. The idea of having to spread Christianity and convert unbelievers became an important part of the legitimacy of seafaring and conquest. Many explorers and their clients actually believed that they were acting in the service of God. They wanted to proselytize new peoples, find Christian allies, or bypass Muslim powers economically and politically. The search for a Christian ruler in the East, such as the legendary priest King John, shows how much religious hopes were linked to geographical curiosity. They hoped for alliances against Islam, access to distant Christian empires, and the possibility of placing the world more under the sign of the cross. Mission, trade, and politics were closely intertwined. At the same time, the reference to God often served as a moral justification for expansion. When a country was conquered in the name of faith, the violence seemed legitimate or even necessary in the eyes of many involved. The conversion of foreign peoples was often presented as a good cause, even if in practice it was often accompanied by coercion, oppression, and cultural destruction. Religious language often covered up economic interests and claims to power. But it was precisely this connection that made the motif so effective. For those who were convinced that they were fighting for God, for the king, and for their own advantage at the same time, had a particularly strong inner justification. However, one must not make the mistake of dismissing religious motives only as a pretext. For many people of that time, faith was not an empty formula, but a real, deeply felt force. Even men who sought wealth could be convinced that God was guiding their path. In this era, it was not unusual to combine economic profit and religious mission. People thought less in clearly separated areas than we do today. A sailor could simultaneously search for treasure, honor his king, and believe in the spread of the faith. It was precisely this mixture of interests and convictions that shaped the Age of Discovery to a particular degree. In addition to gold and God, fame also played a decisive role. In a society that was strongly focused on honor, prestige, and rank, fame had enormous value. Those who distinguished themselves through bravery, determination, or success could go down in history and make their name immortal. For nobles, the acquisition of honor was a central goal in life. But fame was also a desirable commodity for merchants, seafarers, and up-and-comers, because it brought recognition, influence, and often material advantages. A successful explorer became not only rich, but also famous. His name could be associated with an island, a cape, a strait, or even an entire continent. This desire for fame was closely linked to the image of man in the Renaissance. During this time, the idea grew in educated circles that man could achieve greatness through his own achievement. Ancient models played an important role in this. The heroes of history, generals, statesmen, and scholars were considered examples of how one could rise above the crowd through deeds. Explorers fit well into this ideal. They faced the dangers of the unknown, surpassing seemingly natural boundaries and demonstrating courage, wisdom, and willpower. This made them figures that evoked admiration. For rulers, fame was also important. A king who opened up new territories, expanded his influence across seas, and brought exotic riches to his empire increased his prestige against rival powers. Voyages of discovery were therefore also propaganda. They demonstrated strength, foresight, and divine favor. When Spain or Portugal financed expeditions, it was not only out of sober calculation. It was also about appearing as a leading power. The fame of the explorer was often at the same time the fame of the ruler in whose name he sailed. The three motifs of gold, God, and fame cannot be neatly separated from each other. They overlapped constantly. Those who sought gold could also gain fame. Those who traveled in the name of God could acquire wealth in the process. Those who sought fame often needed the favor of rulers who pursued economic or religious goals. This connection made the Age of Discovery so powerful. These were not isolated motives, but a bundle of interests that drove both individuals and states. In addition, the motives were weighted differently depending on the person and situation. For some, trade was in the foreground, for others the mission, for still others personal ambition. Christopher Columbus, for example, hoped for wealth, titles, and historical greatness. At the same time, he was deeply religious and interpreted his travels in a Christian sense. Vasco da Gama pursued economic and strategic goals for Portugal, but also moved in a world in which religious differences and mission played a major role. The Conquistadors in America were often driven in a special way by the hope of quick wealth and social advancement, but they too often justified their actions with faith and service to the crown. Moreover, these motives had an effect not only on the leaders of the expeditions, but also on the crews and the societies behind them. Sailors, soldiers, priests, interpreters, and settlers each had their own hopes. Some were looking for work, others wanted to escape poverty, and still others were hoping for land, loot, or a better life. Even if they didn't all think in big historical categories, they did become part of a system held together by gold, God, and glory. Even the enthusiasm of the population for travel reports and exotic stories contributed to making the explorers appear as admirable figures and to support further ventures. At the same time, the dark side of these motifs should not be overlooked. The desire for gold often led to brutal exploitation. The search for wealth destroyed communities, robbed people of their freedom, and turned entire regions into theaters of colonial violence. The reference to God was used to legitimize submission, to devalue foreign cultures, and to enforce conversion by force. The desire for fame blinded some men to the suffering they caused, because they had their own greatness in mind above all. The motives that drove the Age of Discovery were thus not only causes of movement and change, but also sources of injustice. This is precisely one of the most important findings about this epoch. The great journeys were not merely an expression of human curiosity or a noble spirit of research. They arose from interests that were often closely linked to power. Those who wanted gold usually wanted control. Those who had God in their mouths often claimed moral superiority. Those who sought fame were prepared to accept risks and often the suffering of others. That's not to say that every single explorer was cynical or cruel. But the structures in which they operated rewarded expansion, conquest, and appropriation. And yet it would be too easy to condemn these people only from today's perspective, without understanding their world. The men of the 15th and 16th centuries lived in a time when faith, honor, and possessions were thought of differently than they are today. For them, it could be completely natural to see distant countries as a trading opportunity, a mission field, and a stage of glory at the same time. This is precisely why it is so important to take a close look at their motives. This is the only way to understand why the Age of Discovery began with such force and why it changed the world so profoundly. Gold, God, and glory were therefore not mere slogans. They were the central forces that carried European expansion across the seas. They combined economic greed with a religious sense of mission and personal ambition. They drove kings, merchants, captains, and soldiers. They turned dangerous expeditions into major political projects. And they created the moral and material foundations for an epoch that on the one hand opened up new world connections, but on the other hand also produced subjugation, colonialism, and violence. If we want to understand the motives of the explorers, we must therefore always see both sides. Behind the courage, there was often calculation. Behind faith, there was often power. Behind the fame was often destruction. But it is precisely these contradictions that explain why the Age of Discovery was not just a succession of spectacular journeys, but the beginning of a global upheaval. The ships that set sail at that time not only carried men and goods on board. They carried hopes, fears, beliefs, and interests that would change the world forever. Chapter 4: Technical Advances in Navigation and Shipbuilding. The great voyages of discovery of the 15th and 16th centuries were not only the result of courage, ambition, or economic interest. They were also made possible by technical developments that made travel across wide seas safer, more plannable, and more successful. Without advances in navigation, cartography, and shipbuilding, European seafarers would hardly have been able to circumnavigate the coasts of Africa, cross the Atlantic, or find a sea route to India. The Age of Discovery has therefore always been an age of practical knowledge. It was based on experience, observation, calculation, and the ability to adopt and further develop existing knowledge from different cultures. The oceans were not opened up by bravery alone, but by technology. To understand the significance of these advances, one must first consider how difficult seafaring was in earlier centuries. Coastal voyages had been known for a long time, and people had also sailed across the Mediterranean or along familiar trade routes for centuries. But the open sea posed completely different challenges. As soon as the coast disappeared from view, there were no fixed points of orientation. Winds could change suddenly, currents could drive ships away, storms could put crews in danger. Anyone who moved over long distances on the sea had to know roughly where they were, in which direction they were steering, and how they could keep their planned course despite changing conditions. This was one of the greatest challenges before the Age of Discovery. Early seafarers were mainly guided by coastlines, well-known landmarks, and the position of the sun and stars. As long as you were in familiar waters, that was often enough. But for long journeys across the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, this type of orientation was no longer sufficient. For this reason, instruments and methods became increasingly important that could be used to determine direction, position, and distance, at least approximately. Navigation was never completely accurate, but it became more reliable over time. And the more seafarers gained experience, the better they were able to interpret natural phenomena and plan their voyages. A central tool was the compass. Its origins lie in China, from where the knowledge of magnetic orientation reached Europe via various routes. The compass did not show the exact location of a ship, but it helped to keep a cardinal direction independent of visibility. This was especially important when clouds obscured the stars or fog restricted visibility. With a compass, captains could maintain a direction even on the open sea without having to constantly rely on coastlines. As a result, seafaring gained stability and predictability. So the compass was not a miracle instrument, but it was a crucial building block on the way to larger expeditions. Equally important was astronomical navigation. Seafarers learned to use the position of the sun and stars to roughly determine their geographical latitude, i.e. their north-south position. Instruments such as the astrolabe, and later also the quadrant and the Jacob's staff, helped with this. These devices made it possible to measure the angle between the horizon and a celestial body. The North Star in particular played an important role in the Northern Hemisphere, because its height above the horizon gave an approximate indication of how far north or south a ship was. During the day, the sun could also serve as orientation. These methods were not perfect, especially in choppy seas or bad weather. But for the first time they gave seafarers a more systematic means of calculating their situation, at least in part. The geographical longitude, i.e. the east-west position, on the other hand, remained a major problem for a long time. At that time, there were no precise clocks that could be used to reliably measure the time difference between the home port and the current location. Therefore, sailors usually had to estimate their length. This estimate was based on speed, direction of travel, and time traveled. This procedure is often referred to as dead reckoning. They tried to calculate where the ship would have to be from the observed data. This was error-prone, but with experience, practice, and supplementary observations, it could be quite useful. Many voyages of the Age of Discovery were therefore a mixture of astronomical measurement, practical estimation, and seafaring instinct. In addition to instruments, knowledge of winds and currents was also of enormous importance. Over time, seafarers learned that the sea was not simply an empty space, but was shaped by certain natural patterns. In the Atlantic, for example, trade winds and ocean currents play an important role. Portuguese and later Spanish sailors made the experience that return journeys were not always possible on the direct outward journey. Sometimes you had to go far west or north to find favorable winds. This knowledge of wind systems was revolutionary because it showed that successful seafaring depended not only on heading straight for a destination, but also on understanding the dynamics of the sea. Those who knew the winds could cover longer distances more safely. Portugal in particular developed a special competence in this regard early on. The Portuguese sailors, who gradually explored the West African coast, gained valuable experience about Atlantic currents and seasonal wind conditions. This resulted in practical navigation knowledge that was later decisive for further expeditions. This knowledge was not only preserved in the minds of individual sailors, but increasingly also recorded in manuals, records, and charts. Seafaring thus became an art that could be passed on systematically. Experience remained important, but it was increasingly linked to written knowledge. This is where cartography comes into play. In the Middle Ages, maps were often symbolic representations of the world rather than precise tools for navigation. But with the expansion of maritime trade and the first major expeditions, the need for more accurate maps grew. So-called portolan cards became particularly important. These nautical charts showed coastlines, ports, distances, and directions much more accurately than many older depictions. They were primarily intended for practical navigation and helped captains to better navigate familiar routes. Even though early maps still had many gaps, errors, and distortions, they were improved with each journey. New coasts were drawn, shoals were marked, and distances were estimated more precisely. The map was thus no longer just an image of the world, but a working instrument of the Age of Discovery. At the same time, cartography changed the way we think about space. Areas that had previously been considered distant, vague, or legendary were now measured, named, and placed in larger contexts. Maps not only helped with navigation, but also with mastery. Anyone who mapped a coast made it available from a European perspective. Maps have therefore always been political tools. They served trade, but also expansion and the claim to ownership. Technical progress was therefore not neutral. He was closely associated with power. But even the best maps and instruments would have been of little use if the ships had not been suitable for long voyages. Therefore, progress in shipbuilding was at least as important as the development of navigation. In the Middle Ages, various types of ships already existed in Europe, such as heavy merchant ships for the Mediterranean or robust vehicles for coastal voyages. However, for long voyages on the open ocean, ships had to meet several requirements. They had to be able to transport sufficient provisions and water, be stable enough for storms, but at the same time agile enough to take advantage of different wind conditions. In addition, they should remain controllable with a small to medium crew. It was precisely out of these requirements that ship types developed that became decisive for the Age of Discovery. The caravel is particularly famous. This ship was comparatively light, maneuverable, and very well suited for reconnaissance trips. It could be used both along coasts and on the open sea. An important advantage was its rigging. Many caravels used triangular lateen sails, which came from the Mediterranean region and ultimately from older Arab and Mediterranean traditions. Such sails made it possible to cruise better against the wind than pure square sails. This made the ships more agile and was particularly helpful in difficult coastal conditions or changing winds. The caravel was therefore ideal for voyages of discovery, where unknown coasts were explored and flexible course changes were necessary. For longer journeys and greater transport requirements, other types of ships were also used, such as the carrack. It was larger than the caravel, could carry more cargo, and was better suited for long journeys with extensive equipment, trade goods, or armed crew. Such ships were often heavier and more sluggish, but more resilient and versatile. In practice, the types of ships complement each other. Smaller, agile ships could explore and map. Larger ships transported goods, supplies, and people. This combination increased the chances of success of many expeditions. The construction of the ships also improved. Hull shapes have been further developed, stability has been increased, and load capacity has been better utilized. The ships were often given raised fore and aft forts, which offered protection on the one hand and military advantages in armed conflicts at sea on the other. Over time, ships became more heavily armed, which became especially important as trade and conquest moved closer together. Cannons on board turned merchant ships into instruments of military power. Technical progress in shipbuilding was thus not only a prerequisite for discovery, but also for control, intimidation, and violence. An often underestimated point is the organization on board. Long sea voyages require not only good ships, but also well-thought-out stockpiling and discipline. Water, non-perishable food, tools, sail replacements, ropes and weapons had to be carried. The crew had to be assigned, the ship regularly maintained and checked for damage. Navigation, control, and sail guidance required experience and cooperation. This meant that seafaring practice itself was also a part of technical progress. Technology consisted not only of equipment and wood, but also of knowledge, routine, and organization. In addition, Europe benefited greatly from knowledge that came from other regions of the world during this time. Many of the tools and methods used in the Age of Discovery were not purely European inventions. The compass, astronomical knowledge, mathematical procedures, and even certain sailing techniques had roots in China, the Arab Islamic region, or the Mediterranean region. Europe adopted, combined, and changed this knowledge for its own purposes. It was precisely this ability to bring together different traditions in practice that was decisive. The Age of Discovery was therefore not based on isolated European genius, but also on global knowledge transfer. With each successful trip, the overall technical knowledge improved. New coasts were surveyed, better routes discovered, instruments adapted, and ships tested. Mistakes from previous expeditions could be evaluated. This created a self-reinforcing process. Technical progress made further journeys possible, and these journeys in turn provided experiences that led to new progress. The further the seafarers got, the greater their knowledge advantage in certain areas of navigation and maritime organization. All this shows that the great discoveries should not be understood as sudden heroic deeds of individual men. Behind every voyage was a whole system of craftsmen, map-makers, instrument makers, mathematicians, seafarers, port authorities, and political clients. The oceans were conquered not only by audacity, but by a culture of learning and adapting. The ship was a technical feat of its time, but it was only useful if people could operate it, repair it, and use it properly. Navigation, on the other hand, was only helpful when observations, calculations, and experience interacted. The age of discovery was therefore also an age of technical condensation. Various developments, some of which had been known for a long time, were now combined in such a way that long-distance travel across the ocean became possible on a larger scale. The compass gave direction, astronomical instruments helped to determine position, maps organized space, wind knowledge made it possible to choose a clever route, and new types of ships made long journeys practicable. It was only from this interplay that the maritime capability grew with which European powers could begin their expansion. At the same time, one must not forget that technology here did not only mean progress in a positive sense. The improved ships and navigation methods made it possible not only to gain knowledge and trade, but also to colonialism, the slave trade, and military subjugation. What appears to be a technical achievement has had profound human consequences. The caravels and carracks brought not only explorers to distant shores, but also soldiers, missionaries, traders, and conquerors. Technology was therefore a tool, and like any tool, it could be used for construction as well as destruction. When we look at the technical advances in navigation and shipbuilding today, we see them as a crucial key to understanding the age of discovery. Without these developments, the great expeditions would hardly have been conceivable. They no longer made the sea just a dividing border, but a connecting and controllable route. They shifted the horizon of what humans could do on the water, and they created the conditions for a new global phase of history. Chapter 4 of the Age of Discovery was not only a story of wood, sails, and instruments. It was the story of how knowledge was translated into movement. Observations became methods, methods became journeys, and journeys gave rise to a new connection between the continents. Technical progress was thus not a marginal topic of the discoveries, but one of their supporting foundations. Without him, the maps would have remained empty, the horizons would have been distant, and many of the later upheavals in world history might have taken a very different course. Chapter 5: Portugal as a pioneer of voyages of discovery. If you ask about the actual starting point of the Age of Discovery, the path almost always leads to Portugal. Even before Spain came to the fore in world history with the voyage of Christopher Columbus, Portugal had already established itself as Europe's leading seafaring nation for decades. The small kingdom on the outermost edge of the continent played a role that seems astonishing at first glance. Because Portugal was neither large in terms of area nor populace. It did not have the means of power of later empires, and was located on the western edge of Europe, far away from the major political centers of the continent. And yet it was precisely this country that began early on to systematically explore the Atlantic, circumnavigate the African coast, and finally open the sea route to India. Portugal thus became a pioneer of voyages of discovery, and laid the foundation for a development that profoundly changed world history. To understand why Portugal in particular took on this role, one must first look at the country's special situation. Portugal was not only geographically advantageous on the Atlantic coast, but was also politically united and stable comparatively early on. While many other European regions were still marked by internal conflicts, dynastic disputes, or fragmented power relations, Portugal was already able to build on a relatively consolidated monarchy in the late Middle Ages. This political stability was a decisive advantage. Great voyages of discovery require long-term planning, financial support, and the willingness to invest in risky undertakings. A state that could pool its forces had better prerequisites for this than an empire that was constantly busy with internal power struggles. In addition, there was the maritime orientation of the country. Portugal was bordered on one side by the Atlantic Ocean and had only a land border with Castile, which later became the core of Spain. For the Portuguese, the sea was therefore not just a peripheral area, but a living space, a transport route, and an opportunity. Fishing, coastal shipping, and trade have long been part of everyday life. Portuguese ports were connected by trade networks that stretched across the Atlantic and Mediterranean seas. This gave rise to a culture early on in which maritime knowledge, nautical experience, and looking beyond the horizon were more important than in some inland regions of Europe. The sea was not a distant adventure for Portugal, but a familiar part of life. Another important background was the Reconquista, i.e., the centuries-long struggle of Christian empires on the Iberian Peninsula against Muslim rule. Portugal was deeply involved in this development. As the kingdom expanded southwards and consolidated its territorial position, a political and religious self-image emerged that combined expansion with Christian mission. The fight against Muslim powers strongly influenced the thinking of the elites. This experience had a lasting effect when Portugal began to explore the Atlantic Ocean and the African coast. Expansion across the sea seemed to many not only as an economic opportunity, but also as a continuation of a religiously and politically charged movement. Trade, power politics, and the Christian idea of mission were combined early on. At the center of the Portuguese early phase of the discoveries is a figure who is still closely associated with this departure today: Henry the Navigator. The name is almost legendary, even if it is misleading in many respects. Heinrich himself was not a great explorer who personally undertook countless journeys. Rather, his significance lay in the fact that, as a prince of the Portuguese royal family, he promoted, organized, and politically supported maritime enterprises. He realized early on that exploring the African coast could open up new avenues for Portugal to wealth, influence, and strategic advantage. Therefore, he invested in expeditions, collected knowledge, and contributed to the fact that seafaring in Portugal became a state task. Henry's name is closely associated with Sagres, a place on the southwestern tip of Portugal, which is often portrayed in historical memory as a center of nautical research. Although the idea of a real seafaring school in modern form is probably exaggerated, there is no doubt that knowledge about navigation, maps, winds, and coasts was collected and put to practical use under Henry's influence. He promoted cartographers, captains, and experienced sailors, and created an environment in which maritime knowledge could be systematically developed. In doing so, he helped to lay the foundation on which later Portuguese successes could be built. The first Portuguese expeditions were mainly directed towards the Atlantic and the northwest African coast. As early as the 15th century, Portuguese navigators began to explore archipelagos such as Madeira and the Azores and include them in Portugal's sphere of influence. These islands had a double meaning. On the one hand, they offered new agricultural land and strategic bases on the Atlantic. On the other hand, they served as testing grounds for colonial forms of rule, agricultural exploitation, and maritime supply systems. Sugar cultivation in Madeira in particular became an early example of those colonial economic structures that would later emerge on a larger scale in America. This already shows that Portugal's expansion was not only a desire for discovery, but also aimed at economic control and exploitation from the very beginning. At the same time, Portuguese ships gradually worked their way south along the West African coast. These undertakings were dangerous and were initially accompanied by fears and uncertainty. Many European sailors feared unknown waters, extreme heat, ocean currents, or mythical dangers beyond the familiar world. Cape Bojador on the coast of the Sahara in particular has long been considered the limit of navigability. When Portuguese sailors finally overcame this obstacle, it was not only a practical breakthrough, but also a psychological one. It showed that the known world could be expanded step by step if you had the courage to cross the boundaries of the familiar. With each subsequent voyage, Portugal gained new knowledge about winds, currents, coastlines, and trade opportunities. This slow, systematic approach to Africa distinguished Portugal from later spectacular individual trips. The Portuguese expansion was not a sudden leap at first, but a process of touching, learning, and condensing. They did not sail to India immediately, but gained experience over decades. It was precisely this perseverance that was one of the keys to success. Portugal did not use the discovery as a one-off sensation. but as a long-term project. Economically, the returns of these ventures were quickly visible. Along the African coast, the Portuguese encountered trade networks in which gold, ivory, pepper, and other goods circulated. West African gold in particular was of great interest to Portugal. Access to these resources strengthened the Portuguese crown financially and increased the attractiveness of further expeditions. At the same time, a trade with enslaved people developed, which became one of the darkest chapters of Portuguese expansion. Early on, Portuguese traders began to forcibly abduct people from Africa and treat them as goods. This practice was initially practiced on a smaller scale, but over time it would become a central part of the emerging Atlantic system. Portugal was thus not only a pioneer in navigation, but unfortunately also in the development of those forms of trade and rule that would later cause suffering to millions of people. The Portuguese crown quickly realized that maritime expansion promised not only economic gains, but also political power. Those who explored coasts, established bases, and controlled trade routes were able to extend their influence over wide areas without having to deploy large land armies. Portugal therefore developed a form of expansion that relied heavily on naval supremacy, fortified trading posts, and strategic hubs. Unlike later colonial empires, which wanted to dominate large inland areas directly, Portugal initially concentrated on ports, islands, and coastal towns. This form was particularly suitable for a small kingdom because it could achieve great effects with comparatively limited resources. A decisive step on this path was the circumnavigation of the Cape of Good Hope by Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. This success marked a historic turning point. For the first time, it was proven that the Atlantic Ocean merged into the Indian Ocean and that Africa could be circumnavigated at its southern tip. This made one of Europe's great geographical hopes a reality. The sea route to India was possible in principle. Dias himself did not yet reach India, but his journey opened the door to a new phase of Portuguese expansion. What had previously been a vision now became a concrete goal. Only a few years later, Vasco da Gama continued on this path. In 1497 he set out on behalf of the Portuguese king, circumnavigated the Cape of Good Hope, and actually reached India in 1498. This trip was of enormous importance because it gave Portugal direct access to the trading centers of the Indian Ocean. Spices and other valuable goods no longer had to reach Europe exclusively through Arab, Persian, Indian, and Mediterranean intermediaries. Portugal had created a direct sea connection that changed world trade permanently. The dream that Portuguese expansion had pursued for decades had become a reality. With the arrival of India, Portugal finally transformed itself from a regional power into a globally active kingdom. In the years that followed, the Portuguese established a network of bases along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Places like Goa, Malacca, and later Macau became part of a far-reaching system that combined trade, military presence, and political influence. Portugal did not control the entire Indian Ocean, but it secured important points where the flow of goods could be directed, tariffs could be levied, and opponents could be fought. The Portuguese strategy was based on dominating maritime hubs rather than conquering vast territories inside. This was precisely where their efficiency lay. But Portugal's rise as a pioneer of voyages of discovery was not only a story of success and innovation. It was also closely linked to violence. Portuguese expansion was often based on military superiority at sea, intimidation, the destruction of competing trade structures, and the exploitation of regional conflicts. In the Indian Ocean, Portugal encountered complex and old trade networks that had by no means waited for European leadership. In order to assert themselves there, Portuguese commanders repeatedly resorted to brutal means. Trade and cannons went hand in hand. This connection was typical of the Portuguese model. Economic interests were secured by maritime force. The expansion also changed the kingdom domestically. The crown gained prestige and revenue, merchants benefited from long-distance trade, and Portugal's self-image changed. The small country increasingly saw itself as a chosen maritime power, whose task was to open up new paths and expand Christian influence. Travel reports, maps, and exotic goods strengthened the feeling of being part of a historical awakening. Portugal became a symbol of maritime audacity and strategic foresight. For a time, it seemed as if this small kingdom had found the key to the world. Portugal's success was by no means a matter of course. The journeys were risky, expensive, and often accompanied by setbacks. Ships were lost, crews died of disease or starvation, and many expeditions initially yielded less profit than hoped. But Portugal had the stamina to cope with these setbacks and learn from them. It was precisely this combination of government support, practical experience, geographical location, and economic ambition that made the country a pioneer. Portugal was successful not because it had unlimited resources, but because it consistently focused its limited resources on a clear goal. At the same time, Portugal's actions created a model that other powers watched closely. The idea of gaining new trade routes, riches, and positions of power through maritime expansion was contagious. Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands were to find their own ways to adopt, expand, or challenge this model in the following centuries. In this sense, Portugal was a pioneer not only in the practical sense, but also in the historical model. It showed Europe that the ocean was not an insurmountable obstacle, but a stage for political and economic expansion. So when we call Portugal a pioneer of voyages of discovery, we mean much more than just the fact that Portuguese ships were on the road early. Portugal was the first European kingdom to make maritime exploration a long-term state project. It combined navigation, cartography, shipbuilding, trade, mission, and power politics into a new form of global action. It systematically felt its way into unknown spaces, gathered knowledge, set up bases, and thus changed the structure of world trade. At the same time, the whole ambivalence of the Age of Discovery was already evident in Portugal. On the one hand, there was courage, technical achievement, and strategic thinking. On the other hand, there was exploitation, violence, and the beginnings of a system based on enslavement and colonial rule. Portugal opened up new routes across the seas, but these routes were not only paths of knowledge and trade, but also routes of subjugation and human degradation. This is precisely why Portugal's role is so central to understanding the Age of Discovery. In this small kingdom, many forces were concentrated that were to shape the coming epoch: the search for wealth, the combination of mission and expansion, the importance of technical competence, the power of the state, and the willingness to include distant regions in a European-dominated system. Portugal was the laboratory in which many elements of early globalization were tested on a large scale for the first time. Thus, the Age of Discovery began not with a single heroic moment, but with the persistent work of a small Atlantic empire that gradually expanded its horizons. Portugal was the first state in Europe to muster the courage, knowledge, and political determination to systematically turn the sea into an area of expansion. Therein lies its historical significance. It was the pioneer of a movement that connected the world and at the same time shook it deeply. Chapter 6: Christopher Columbus and the Journey to the West. When you think of the Age of Discoveries, one name almost always comes up first: Christopher Columbus. Hardly any other figure is as closely associated with the beginning of European expansion across the Atlantic as he is. His journey in 1492 is still considered one of the most famous events in world history. In many older depictions, Columbus appears as a courageous visionary who prevailed over doubts and discovered a new world. But the more closely you look at his person and his journey to the West, the clearer it becomes that the reality was far more complicated. Columbus was not the first person in America. He himself did not understand where he had ended up for a long time, and his travels had consequences far beyond the simple idea of a discovery. They mark not only a geographical turning point, but also the beginning of an era of conquest, colonization, and global upheaval. Christopher Columbus was probably born in 1451 in Genoa, an important port and trading city in today's Italy. Not everything is known for sure about his early years, but there is much to suggest that he came into contact with the world of trade and seafaring at an early age. Genoa was a place where the sea was not just a landscape, but the basis of life. Ships, merchants, maps, and stories from distant regions were part of everyday life. Columbus learned the craft of seafaring, probably sailed at a young age, and over time developed a strong interest in navigation, geography, and the possibilities of long-distance trade. Later he lived for a long time in Portugal, where he got involved in one of the societies that were most looking for new sea routes at the time. In the 15th century, Portugal was, as already described, the leading seafaring nation in Europe. There, they had begun to systematically explore the African coast in the hope of finding a sea route to India. Columbus thus lived in an environment in which geographical issues, nautical planning, and the search for new trade routes were intensively discussed. Unlike the Portuguese, however, who wanted to circumnavigate Africa, Columbus relied on a different idea. He was convinced that Asia could be reached by sea by sailing west across the Atlantic. This idea was not entirely absurd. Since ancient times, educated people have known that the Earth is spherical. Columbus also did not believe that the Earth was flat, contrary to the science of his time. His problem was different. He underestimated her size considerably. Columbus relied on calculations and reports that led him to conclude that the distance between Europe and Asia across the Atlantic was much shorter than it actually is. In doing so, he combined correct basic assumptions with erroneous figures. He overestimated the extent of Asia to the east and at the same time underestimated the circumference of the Earth. Thus, in his thinking, a world arose in which Japan, China, or India were much closer west of Europe than was really the case. So for him, the trip seemed risky, but doable. For many contemporaries, however, his plan was unrealistic, not because they disputed the spherical shape of the Earth, but because they considered the distances to be too great. Columbus first tried to gain support for his idea in Portugal, but there his project was rejected. The Portuguese crown continued to rely on the sea route along Africa and apparently had doubts about his calculations. Columbus then turned to the Catholic kings of Spain, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. There too, it took time for his project to be heard. Spain was still strongly influenced by the Reconquista, the long struggle against Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. It was not until the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim dominion in Spain, fell in 1492 that the moment was right to envisage new projects. In the same year, Columbus finally received the support he had hoped for. The agreement with the Spanish crown already shows how closely personal ambition and state interests were linked. Columbus not only received ships and equipment, but also had far-reaching rights guaranteed in the event of success. He was to become admiral of the Oceanic Sea, viceroy and governor of the discovered territories, and share in the profits. This makes it clear that his journey was not only understood as a geographical experiment, but as a politically and economically significant undertaking. Behind the departure were hopes for new trade routes, wealth, prestige, and the expansion of Christian rule. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta. The fleet was small, and the journey into the open Atlantic was an enormous challenge for the crew. First, the ships sailed to the Canary Islands, which served as the last important stopover before the actual Atlantic crossing. From there they set off in a westerly direction. For the crew, this meant a trip into largely unknown waters. Even though the Atlantic was not completely unexplored, no one from Europe had penetrated so much west on this route at that time. The crossing was long, monotonous, and psychologically stressful. The men saw no land for weeks, and the uncertainty grew. Reports indicate that unrest and fear on board increased. Columbus therefore had to not only navigate, but also lead, reassure, and maintain the belief in success. On October 12, 1492, land was finally sighted. Columbus and his crew had reached an island that belongs to today's Bahamas. For himself, however, it was not clear that he had arrived on a continent that had previously been unknown from a European point of view. Rather, he believed that he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. That's why he called the inhabitants of these regions Indians, i.e. people from India, a term that later became established in many languages, although it was based on an error. This linguistic misnomer is an early sign of how much Europeans' perceptions were shaped by their expectations. Columbus did not see what was actually in front of him, but interpreted the new through the ideas he already brought with him. On his first voyage, Columbus explored several islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola. He was constantly looking for signs of Asiatic empires, for gold, for trade opportunities, and for proof that he had reached the vicinity of India. Again and again he asked about gold deposits and rulers who could be associated with the great empires of Asia. He observed the people, their way of life, their clothing and their material goods, but interpreted many things through his own worldview. The encounter was marked by inequality from the beginning. Columbus and his men came armed, with political pretensions and with the idea of acting in the name of the Spanish crown and the Christian faith. Already on the first voyage, Columbus captured some locals to bring them to Europe as interpreters and evidence. It shows that his journey was more than mere curiosity from the very beginning. A decisive moment was the shipwreck of the Santa Maria on Christmas 1492 off the coast of Hispaniola. Columbus had a small settlement built from the remains of the ship, which was given the name La Navidad. There he left some men behind before returning to Spain. This step alone makes it clear that his journey should not end as a one-time exploration. It was the prelude to a permanent presence. When Columbus returned to Spain in the spring of 1493, he was received as a great success hero. His reports gave the impression of having reached rich and promising territories that opened up new opportunities for the Spanish crown. Whether he himself really believed in Asia or already suspected that he had come across something else is disputed among historians. What is certain, however, is that he continued to hold on to his interpretation to the outside world. The first trip was just the beginning. In total, Columbus made 4 voyages to the Caribbean and the coasts of Central and South America. With each trip, Spain's claims to the newly reached territories became more concrete, and Europe's presence in the region strengthened. The later expeditions were much larger and more focused on settlement, control, and economic use. Columbus founded settlements, claimed land for the Spanish crown, and tried to establish a colonial order. It quickly became apparent that the reality on the ground was far more difficult than the bright hopes that his first return had triggered. Gold was not found to the extent dreamed of, the supply of the colonists was difficult, conflicts within the Spanish groups increased, and relations with the native societies deteriorated rapidly. It is precisely here that the dark side of Columbus' story begins. In many older textbooks, he was celebrated above all as an explorer. Today it is clearer that his undertakings were closely linked to violence, coercion, and oppression. Under his leadership and within the framework of the colonial structures he initiated, people were forced to work, abused, and deprived of their rights. The indigenous population of the Caribbean suffered not only from direct violence, but also from the consequences of imported diseases against which they had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and other infections spread devastatingly in the decades that followed, decimating entire populations. Columbus himself was not solely responsible for these developments, but his voyages opened the process in which European conquest and colonial exploitation began in America. At the same time, Columbus also became increasingly problematic for the Spanish crown. His administration of the colonies was considered chaotic and brutal, and complaints from settlers piled up. Eventually, he was even arrested at times and brought back to Spain in chains. This shows that he was not simply considered a triumphant hero of his time. Even among his contemporaries, his role was controversial. His vision had opened a new phase of expansion, but as organizer and governor he proved to be overwhelmed or ruthless. The story of Columbus is therefore also a story of the failure of personal ambitions to rule. Nevertheless, the historical significance of his journey remains undeniable. It changed the world. True, there had been contacts across oceans long before Columbus, and the American continents were by no means unknown to their inhabitants. But the voyage of 1492 triggered a lasting connection between Europe and America that had far-reaching consequences. From then on, both spaces were integrated into a common, albeit highly disparate historical process. Plants, animals, people, commodities, diseases, and ideas began to migrate across the Atlantic on a scale that profoundly changed the history of both sides. Historians often speak of Columbian exchange in this context. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes made their way to Europe, horses, cattle, and wheat to America. At the same time, millions of people were enslaved, societies destroyed, and new colonial empires built. Columbus, therefore, stands at a historical intersection. His journey does not mark the discovery of America in the literal sense, because America had long been inhabited, shaped, and culturally developed. But it marks the beginning of a new global connection, the consequences of which can hardly be overestimated. A space of enormous expansion opened up for Europe. For the indigenous societies of the Americas, a catastrophe began that was accompanied by conquest, violence, disease, and loss. Columbus' name is therefore associated with a double legacy, with the dawn of a new world order and with the beginning of a profound injustice. This is precisely why his person is still controversially discussed today. In some traditions, he was celebrated as a hero, a symbol of courage and determination. In other contexts, it is now criticized as a symbol of colonial violence. Both perspectives have their reason, but neither of them alone is sufficient to fully grasp the historical complexity. Columbus was neither just a shining explorer nor just a one-dimensional villain. He was a man of his time, characterized by ambition, faith, greed, and misjudgments. His actions had effects that reached far beyond his person and changed the whole world. His journey to the West was in a way a mistake that made history. He wanted to reach Asia and came across America. Believing that he had found a shorter route to the well-known riches, he instead opened up an entirely new space of European expansion. This is precisely the irony of his story. Columbus did not achieve the goal he had set for himself, and yet he triggered one of the greatest upheavals of modern times. His misjudgment became a world historical event. Therefore, when we look at Christopher Columbus today, we should not just repeat the legend of the heroic navigator or simplify his historical role. It is important to see the journey of 1492 in its full context. It was the product of European competition, economic hopes, religious ideas, and personal ambitions. It was based on nautical knowledge and political support, and it led not only to new maps and routes, but also to subjugation, colonization, and a profound change in the world. So Columbus stands at the beginning of a new era. His ships didn't just cross the Atlantic. With them, a new form of power also crossed the border between the worlds. The journey west was therefore much more than an adventure. It was the prelude to a development that connected continents and at the same time plunged millions of people into suffering. It is precisely this tension that makes the chapter on Christopher Columbus so central to understanding the Age of Discovery. Chapter 7, Vasco da Gama and the Sea Route to India. While Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic with his voyage westwards and inadvertently opened the way to America, Portugal pursued another goal with greater clarity and perseverance: the direct sea route to India. This goal was of enormous importance for the Portuguese crown, because in the European imagination India stood not only for wealth and exotic goods, but above all for access to the coveted spice markets of Asia. The name Vasco da Gama is therefore inextricably linked with one of the greatest breakthroughs of the Age of Discovery. With his voyage, he succeeded for the first time in connecting Europe directly with India by sea. What generations of Portuguese sailors had prepared became reality with him. This voyage was not only a nautical success, but an event that fundamentally changed world trade, the balance of power between continents, and the history of globalization. To understand the significance of Vasco da Gama's journey, one must first look at the background again. Since the 15th century, Portugal had systematically explored the West African coast. This expansion was not a spontaneous consequence of individual inspirations, but part of a long-term state project. Portuguese captains and cartographers spent decades gathering knowledge about currents, coastlines, winds, and trade opportunities. The Crown invested in ships, navigation, and expeditions because it hoped that this would give it direct access to wealth and political influence. At the center of all these efforts was one major goal: to find the sea route to India in order to be able to directly control the trade in spices and other precious goods. The road to get there was long. The Portuguese sailors had to expand their borders step by step. The circumnavigation of the Cape of Good Hope by Bartholomew Dias in 1488 was a decisive milestone. For the first time, it was proven that Africa could be circumnavigated at its southern tip and that the Atlantic Ocean was connected to the Indian Ocean. But although Dias made this breakthrough, he did not reach India himself. His ride was more proof that the goal was basically achievable. It remained a task for the next generation to actually complete the path to the Indian coasts. This task fell to Vasco da Gama. Less is known about his early life than about some other famous figures of his time. He was born around 1460 in Sines on the Portuguese coast and came from the lower nobility. His background was thus typical of many men who made careers in the service of the Portuguese crown. He was not a king, not a great scholar, and initially not a world-famous hero. But he moved in a world in which military experience, loyalty to the crown, and seafaring competence were of great importance. When King Manuel I decided to actually dare the long-prepared journey to India, Vasco da Gama was entrusted with the leadership of the expedition. In 1497, the fleet set out. It consisted of several ships, including the São Gabriel and the São Rafael, as well as a supply ship. The team was relatively small, considering the enormous distance they had to cover. The journey was highly risky. It wasn't just about navigating uncharted waters, but also surviving for months at sea, managing supplies, maintaining crew discipline, and being prepared for potential conflicts. Vasco da Gama's mission was clear. He was to complete the sea route to India and thus provide Portugal with direct access to the Asian trading centers. The route first led along the well-known West African coast. But the Portuguese had understood in the meantime that one could not simply follow coastlines for long sea voyages. To take advantage of favorable winds, they sailed far out into the Atlantic before turning south back towards Africa. This technique was based on the knowledge of wind and current systems acquired over decades. This shows that Vasco da Gama's success was not only based on personal courage, but on a collective Portuguese experience. His journey was the completion of a learning process in which many others before him had contributed. After circumnavigating the Cape of Good Hope, the expedition reached the east coast of Africa. There she encountered a completely different world than on the West African coast. Cities such as Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi were part of an extensive trade network in the Indian Ocean, which had been shaped for centuries by Arab, Persian, Indian, and African merchants. This space was by no means waiting for European explorers. He was already economically highly developed, maritime experienced, and culturally diverse. For the Portuguese, this encounter was therefore instructive in several respects. They realized that they were not the first to enter an unknown world, but entered a trading area that had its own rules, power relations, and traditions. The encounters on the East African coast were not friendly everywhere. Vasco da Gama and his men were suspicious, often arrogant, and only limited in their ability to understand the political and economic conditions. In Mozambique, they initially hoped to be misunderstood as Muslim traders, believing that this could strengthen their position. But the deception did not last long. Tensions arose, and the Portuguese had to move on. They also met with resistance in Mombasa. It was only in Malindi that they found more favorable conditions. There they received support for the onward journey across the Indian Ocean. Particularly important was the help of an experienced pilot who showed them the way to India. This circumstance is historically significant because it once again makes it clear that European expansion was not based solely on one's own knowledge. Without local knowledge and the support of experienced navigators from the existing trading area, the journey would have been much more difficult or perhaps not at all. In 1498, Vasco da Gama finally reached Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. This was a historic breakthrough. For the first time, a European expedition had reached India directly by sea. From a Portuguese point of view, this was a triumph. The dream of direct access to the spice markets had become reality. The trip proved that Europe no longer had to rely solely on the old trade routes across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. But the success was more complicated in reality than it seemed at first glance. Because Vasco da Gama did not come to a power-free territory that could simply be taken possession of. Calicut was a major trading center with wealthy merchants, political authorities, and established connections throughout the Indian Ocean. Goods from India, Arabia, Africa, and Southeast Asia were traded there. The Portuguese were therefore only new, initially rather insignificant players in an existing system. Vasco da Gama hoped to establish trade relations and make the Portuguese mission appear valuable. But his gifts and offers often seemed modest or inappropriate from the point of view of the local elites. The Portuguese did not fully understand the customs of the trading area, and their diplomatic skills were also limited. Instead of being immediately recognized as equal partners, they had to learn that their position was weaker than they had expected. Nevertheless, Vasco da Gama managed to take a small amount of goods on board and start the return journey. This return trip was just as dangerous as the outward journey, if not more dangerous. Diseases, especially scurvy, caused heavy losses among the crew. Many men died, and the expedition was severely weakened on the way back. When Vasco da Gama finally returned to Portugal, he had lost a significant part of his crew, but he had achieved his goal. The crown celebrated him as a hero. The sea route to India had been found. The consequences of this trip were enormous. Portugal now gained the opportunity to enter directly into the spice trade and influence the flow of goods in the Indian Ocean. In the following years, the crown sent more fleets to India. What started with Vasco da Gama became a permanent project. Portugal established bases, concluded forced trade treaties, attacked competing traders, and tried to militarily control central nodes of maritime trade. Places like Goa, Cochin, and later Malacca became part of a wide-ranging Portuguese system. The individual voyage of discovery became a form of maritime rule. It is precisely at this point that it becomes clear that Vasco da Gama's journey must not only be regarded as a success story of technical audacity. It was also the beginning of violent European interference in existing trading areas. The Portuguese came not only as traders, but increasingly as an armed force. They didn't just want to participate in the trade, they wanted to steer it in their favor. In doing so, they used their ships, their artillery, and their willingness to use violence to exert pressure. Vasco da Gama himself was directly involved in this development. On later journeys, he showed great toughness and proceeded with extreme brutality against opponents or perceived opponents. Reports of violence against ships and coastal towns in the Indian Ocean are particularly notorious, making it clear that Portuguese expansion was by no means peaceful. This violence was systematic. Portugal was a comparatively small kingdom and could not send huge land armies to Asia. Instead, it relied on maritime superiority, on cannons, on fortified bases, and on the intimidation of competing powers. The sea route to India was therefore not only a trade route, but also a military corridor. Spices were not brought to Europe by clever treaties alone, but often under conditions of forced dominance. Vasco da Gama's trip thus opened up not only a new economic horizon, but also a new form of European power projection. For Europe, this success had profound consequences. The direct connection to India contributed to the gradual shift in the focus of world trade. Atlantic states such as Portugal and later Spain, England, and the Netherlands gained importance, while traditional mediation centers in the Mediterranean region lost relative power in the long term. The ocean became the central space of business and politics. In this sense, Vasco da Gama's journey was a key event in early globalization. It connected regions that had previously been in contact via intermediate stages, but were now connected more directly and intensively with each other. For the Indian Ocean itself, however, the arrival of the Portuguese did not mean a mere expansion of trade, but a disturbance of existing balances. Local rulers, Arab traders, Indian merchants, and other actors now had to deal with an aggressive new maritime power. Portugal was militarily strong enough to cause considerable damage in some places, but not strong enough to completely control the entire area. As a result, his rule often remained fragile and dependent on alliances, violence, and strategic fortresses. Nevertheless, this presence was enough to influence trade routes and create new dependencies. Vasco da Gama himself became a symbolic figure of this development through his journey. In Portugal, he was considered a hero, a man who had fulfilled the dream of the kingdom. His name stood for courage, perseverance, and national greatness. Later generations made him a central figure in Portuguese remembrance culture. But from today's perspective, his legacy must be viewed in a more differentiated way. He was undoubtedly an important navigator who achieved an extraordinary feat, but he was also part of a system based on violence, arrogance, and colonial access. His journey not only brought about new connections, but also new forms of oppression. It is precisely this ambivalence that makes his historical role so significant. Vasco da Gama stands for the technical and organizational masterpiece of the Age of Discovery, but also for its dark side. The sea route to India was a triumph of navigation, planning, and political will. At the same time, it was the beginning of an era in which European powers tried to subordinate existing trading worlds to their interests by force of arms. As a result, the oceans became not only spaces of exchange, but also spaces of imperial competition. If you summarize the chapter on Vasco da Gama, then one thing above all becomes clear: his journey was not an isolated adventure, but a turning point with a global impact. It was the result of decades of Portuguese preparation, and at the same time the starting signal for a new phase of global integration. Spices, ships, maps, and trade strategies combine with cannons, coercion, and domination in this story. Vasco da Gama reached India, but with him Europe also reached a new stage of its expansion. This made Portugal's dream come true. The small kingdom on the edge of Europe had found direct access to the riches of the East. But the price of this success was high. The trip changed not only Portugal and Europe, but also Africa, India, and the entire Indian Ocean. It opened a route along which not only goods and knowledge flowed, but also claims to power, violence, and colonial ambitions. This is precisely the historical greatness and at the same time the historical burden of Vasco da Gama's achievement. His name stands for a breakthrough that united the world more closely and at the same time divided it more deeply. Chapter 8: America is Discovered and Misunderstood. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in October 1492, a new chapter in world history began from a European perspective. But what happened back then was far more than the mere discovery of an unknown continent. America was not only discovered, but also misunderstood. This is precisely one of the most important keys to understanding this epoch. Europeans encountered a world that had been inhabited, shaped, and culturally shaped by humans for thousands of years. Nevertheless, they interpreted what they saw through their own ideas, desires, and errors. They believed they had reached Asia, called the people they met Indians, searched for gold and great Asian empires, and initially understood the reality of America only very incompletely. From the very beginning, European discovery was therefore a process of misunderstanding that had far-reaching consequences. Even the concept of discovery is problematic. For the people who lived in America, nothing had to be discovered. Their societies existed long before the arrival of the Europeans. From the complex empires of the Aztecs and Incas to the highly developed cities of the Maya and countless other cultures in North, Central, and South America, the continent has been marked by diversity, knowledge, and history. There were trade routes, political orders, religious systems, agricultural innovations, and social structures that had developed over long periods of time. When Europe later spoke of the discovery of America, it only meant the first integration of America into the European worldview. This formulation conceals the fact that America has long been a world of its own. Nevertheless, the encounter of 1492 was a historical turning point. Not because America had been empty before, but because from that moment on, lasting ties developed between Europe and America that profoundly changed both sides. However, these unions were formed under unequal and often violent conditions. Europe did not come to America as a neutral observer, but with a desire for wealth, domination, and religious expansion. Europeans saw what they wanted to see and interpreted the new according to old patterns. Therein lies the misunderstanding that characterizes this chapter. Columbus himself is the best example of this. He was convinced that he had reached Asia by Western Sea route. He interpreted the islands he reached in the Caribbean as peripheral areas of East Asia or as islands off the coast of India or China. Because he did not immediately give up this conviction, he read the people, landscapes, and political conditions of America through Asian glasses. He looked for clues to the Great Khan, to rich cities, to gold sources, and to access to the well-known luxury goods of the East. What he did not find, he explained not as proof of a new continent, but as a sign that he had only reached the peripheries of the hoped-for world. This misunderstanding was not just a personal error on Columbus' part, but a structural problem of European perception. At that time, Europe was shaped in its geographical ideas by ancient authors, medieval maps, travel reports, and religious worldviews. Many people did not expect a completely new world on the other side of the Atlantic, but a different route to regions that were already known. Therefore, what was actually found in America was first translated into familiar terms. Unknown societies became supposedly primitive marginal peoples of Asia, foreign belief systems became pagan errors, diverse political orders became territories that were believed to be appropriated. This misinterpretation had immediate consequences. Because Columbus assumed that he had arrived in territories that were ultimately connected to Asia, he did not treat land and people as part of independent political worlds that could have been recognized as equals. Rather, he claimed the territories he had reached in the name of the Spanish crown. This was a symbolic act, but at the same time a beginning of colonial reality. The people he met were not seen as sovereign subjects, but as inhabitants of territories that could be taken over by Spain. Even in this first access, it becomes clear that discovery and misunderstanding were closely related. Because Europe did not recognize America in its independence, it was easier to treat it as an object of European claims. The first encounters were often characterized by mutual curiosity. The people of the Caribbean saw strangers with strange clothes, metal weapons, ships, and animals they didn't know. The Europeans, on the other hand, were amazed by new landscapes, unknown plants, different ways of life, and material cultures that were very different from their own. But this curiosity did not lead to an equal understanding. Language, worldview, and intentions were too far apart. The Europeans were also armed, organized, and on the road with a clear claim. They not only wanted to understand, but to own, act, proselytize, and rule. An important part of the misunderstanding was that Europeans classified many of America's societies as simpler or lower than they actually were. Where they did not find any monuments, writings, or forms of rule familiar to them, they often concluded that they were backward. In doing so, they overlooked the fact that cultural development cannot only be measured in European standards. Many indigenous societies had complex knowledge in agriculture, medicine, astronomy, architecture, and social organization. Forms of knowledge unknown in Europe in particular were often not recognized as such because they did not fit into the usual categories. So the misunderstanding was not only geographical, but also cultural. Europe did not recognize many things because it only understood what was similar to its own experiences. This limited perception was further reinforced by greed and expectations. From the very beginning, Europeans looked for wealth in America, especially gold. Columbus kept asking for sources of gold, for rulers, for valuable raw materials. Wherever gold jewelry or small quantities of precious metal appeared, the hope for larger treasures immediately grew. This search had a decisive influence on the behavior of Europeans. They did not see the New World first and foremost as a complex living space for other people, but as a space of economic opportunity. This led to a lot of information being distorted. What seemed useful was overemphasized. Anything that didn't fit into the picture was ignored or misinterpreted. Over time, further European expeditions penetrated deeper into the American areas. It gradually became clear that it was not Asia. An important contribution to this insight came from Amerigo Vespucci, after whom the continent was later named. Vespucci argued that the newly reached territories did not simply belong to Asia, but represented a continent of its own. Map makers took up this idea, and so the image of a new world slowly prevailed. But even this new insight did not automatically lead to a better understanding. Although America was now recognized as a separate continent, it remained a projection surface for European hopes, fears, and claims to power. The term New World in particular shows this clearly. This world was not new for those who lived there, but only from a European perspective. But from then on, this perspective determined the way the continent was treated. America appeared as a space of opportunity, a place of wealth, a mission field, and a stage for imperial competition. The independence of the societies living there took a back seat to these European interests. So the misunderstanding changed. At first, it was to mistake America for Asia. Later, it consisted of considering America as fundamentally new and thus malleable for European purposes. This attitude prepared the ground for conquest and colonization. Because if a space is considered new, unused, or insufficiently organized, its appropriation seems easier to legitimize. Many European thinkers and rulers argued that they were bringing Christianity, order, or civilization to America. This was often based on the assumption that the indigenous population was less developed and therefore had no equal claim to land, power, or cultural self-determination. The initial misunderstanding thus turned into an ideology of superiority. It helped to morally justify violence and to present submission as an allegedly necessary measure. In addition, Europeans did not fully understand the impact of their arrival for a long time. The crossing brought not only people and goods to America, but also diseases. Smallpox, measles, flu, and other infections spread among populations that had no immunity to them. The consequences were devastating. In many regions, large parts of the population died within a few decades. Entire communities were wiped out or severely weakened, social structures disintegrated, political orders began to falter. For Europeans, this often appeared as a sign of their superiority or divine providence, but in fact it was a biological catastrophe that radically changed the starting conditions of the encounter. Here, too, the misunderstanding is evident. The Europeans initially hardly recognized the connection between their arrival and the mass deaths or misinterpreted it. So America was not only discovered and misunderstood, but in some ways also reshaped by this misunderstanding. The European misperception was not a harmless error, but had concrete political and human consequences. It contributed to the fact that the inhabitants of America were not treated as equal partners. Instead, structures of forced labor, proselytization, expropriation, and domination emerged early on. The Caribbean became the first experimental field of this colonial order. There it became apparent on a small scale what would later follow on a much larger scale in Central and South America. At the same time, the discovery of America also profoundly changed Europe. The worldview had to be expanded. Maps were redrawn, old authorities were questioned, new questions about geography, natural history, and anthropology were raised. America became the touchstone of European knowledge systems. What did it mean that there was an entire continent on the other side of the Atlantic that the ancient authors did not know? How was this world to be classified in biblical history? Who were its inhabitants, and how did they relate to the Christian order of creation? Such questions occupied scholars, theologians, and rulers alike. America's misunderstandings were therefore not only practical errors, but challenges to the entire European mind. Over time, reports, maps, and descriptions emerged that made America more tangible. But even these representations were often selective, exaggerated, or ideologically colored. Some painted a picture of a paradisiacal natural area, a country without scarcity and without complex rule. Others described the inhabitants as wild, barbaric, or childish. Still others idealized them as innocent nature people. All these images reflected less the reality of America than the European imagination. America became the mirror in which Europe looked at its own hopes, fears, and debates. So the misunderstanding persisted, even as knowledge increased. It was particularly consequential that Europe underestimated America's diversity for a long time. The continent was not a unified space, but consisted of countless societies with very different languages, forms of rule, economic methods, and belief systems. But European reports tend to simplify this diversity. They spoke of the Indians as if it were a single group. This standardization was another misunderstanding that facilitated colonial rule. Those who do not recognize or do not acknowledge the differences treat many people more easily as a formless mass that can be controlled or proselytized. When we say today that America has been discovered and misunderstood, we mean several levels at the same time. Geographically, a new continent was included in the European worldview, but initially misclassified. Culturally, Europe encountered highly complex societies, but did not sufficiently recognize their independence. Politically, European powers claimed territories whose existing orders they did not take seriously. Morally, they justified rule by notions of superiority and mission. All of this combined made the discovery of America a process that was based on unequal knowledge and power from the beginning. Nevertheless, this encounter was not just a one-sided story of European perception. The people of America also tried to interpret the newcomers. They classified the foreigners into their own religious, political, and cultural patterns. On their side, too, there was uncertainty, strategic considerations, errors, and learning processes. Some saw the Europeans as possible allies, others as a threat, and still others initially tried to fit them into familiar categories. So the misunderstanding was initially reciprocal, but the balance of power decided which interpretation had the greater effect in the end. Europe was able to impose its view with weapons, ships, and political organization. This is precisely the tragedy of this chapter. The discovery could theoretically also have led to a process of mutual learning. Instead, it largely became the prelude to a colonial new order in which Europe set the rules. America was inscribed in European maps, terms, and systems of rule, often without regard for the people who lived there. What was discovered was simultaneously appropriated, renamed, and reinterpreted. The misunderstanding was therefore not a marginal phenomenon, but part of the actual historical process. Thus, Chapter 8 marks a pivotal moment in the Age of Discovery. America came into Europe's field of vision, but not in clear recognition, but in a mixture of curiosity, error, greed, and claim to power. The continent was not simply found, but forced into European ideas. This misperception gave rise to a new world order in which America became the scene of conquest, exploitation, and profound cultural transformation. When we look back on this moment today, we must therefore be careful with the old terms. America became visible to Europe, yes, but it was not really understood. And it was precisely because it was misunderstood that a history began in which knowledge and violence, amazement and arrogance, encounter and destruction were closely linked. This makes the discovery of America one of the most momentous and at the same time most contradictory events in world history. Chapter 9: The Conquest of New Worlds, Conquistadors and Empires. With the arrival of the Europeans in America, not only a time of discovery began, but very quickly also a time of conquest. What had initially begun as a search for new trade routes and foreign shores turned into a huge process of military subjugation, political appropriation, and economic exploitation within a few decades. At the center of this trial were the conquistadors, those Spanish conquerors whose name is still associated with greed for gold, courage, violence, and the overthrow of great empires. They advanced into regions that were completely foreign to them, encountered powerful empires, and brought them under their control in an astonishingly short time. But this development was neither a miracle nor solely the work of individual heroes. It was the result of an interplay of military force, internal tensions in the indigenous realms, disease, religious justification, and imperial ambition. The term conquistador comes from the Spanish word conquista, i.e. conquest. This alone shows that it was no longer just about discovery or exploration. The men who came to America did not want to see what was there alone. They wanted land, wealth, titles, power, and influence. Many of them came from rather modest backgrounds of the lower nobility or from military milieus in which fame and booty were important motivations. At the beginning of the 16th century, Spain was shaped by the experience of the Reconquista, that centuries-long struggle against Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. This past had produced a culture in which military expansion, Christian mission, and personal honor were closely linked. When new spaces opened up on the other side of the Atlantic after 1492, this thinking was transferred to the New World. Although the conquistadors acted in the name of the Spanish crown, they were often initially private entrepreneurs of the war. They gathered men around them, organized equipment, promised booty, and hoped for later recognition by the king. Their enterprises were therefore half state, half private. It was precisely this mixture that made them dangerous. They were ambitious, often brutal, and willing to take great risks, because wealth and social advancement beckoned to them if they succeeded. At the same time, they claimed to be acting in the service of the crown and Christianity. In this way, personal greed and imperial legitimacy combined to form an explosive force. Probably the best-known story of this phase of conquest is that of the Aztec Empire in Mexico. When Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of present-day Mexico in 1519, the Aztec Empire was a powerful political order. Its center was the impressive capital Tenochtitlan, a large city with temples, markets, streets, and canals, located on islands in a lake. For the Spaniards who came from Europe or the Caribbean, this city must have seemed overwhelming. The empire was complexly organized, relying on tribute, military power, and religious rituals, and ruled large parts of central Mexico. But like any empire, this empire was not free of internal tensions. Many subjugated peoples hated the tributes they had to pay to the Aztecs and suffered from their political dominance. Cortés quickly recognized these tensions and skillfully exploited them. The success of the Spaniards was based not only on firearms, horses, and steel weapons, but to a large extent on alliances with indigenous groups fighting against the Aztecs. Allies such as the Tlaxcaltecs were particularly important, who saw in the Spaniards a chance to overthrow their powerful enemy. This makes a crucial point clear: the Spaniards did not simply conquer America alone. They interfered in existing conflicts, exploited local rivalries, and exploited enmities. The conquest was therefore often a civil war in the broader sense, in which European troops took advantage of an existing conflict situation. Another key to Cortés' success was the character of Malinche, also known as Dona Marina. She was an indigenous woman who played a central role as an interpreter, mediator, and advisor to Cortés. They were used for communication, negotiations, and important information. Their role shows that conquest was not only based on weapons, but also on language, diplomacy, and cultural translation. Without such mediators, the Spaniards would not have been able to cope with many situations. At the same time, Malinche's story is a symbol of the complicated, often tragic interconnections of this era, in which people were caught between fronts and drawn into colonial power processes. When Cortés finally reached Tenochtitlan, he met the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II. The meeting between the two sides is one of the most famous and at the same time most discussed moments in world history. For a long time, the story was told as if the Aztecs had initially considered the Spaniards to be divine beings. Today, this simplified presentation is viewed critically. It is more likely that Moctezuma reacted cautiously, diplomatically, and uncertainly to a new threat that is difficult to assess. What is clear, however, is that Cortés took advantage of the situation. He effectively arrested the ruler, thus exacerbating tensions and finally triggering an open conflict. After fierce fighting, the Spaniards had to leave Tenochtitlan for the time being, but returned with their indigenous allies. In 1521, the city fell after a cruel siege. This shattered the Aztec Empire. The downfall of Tenochtitlan was not only of enormous military importance, but also symbolically. One of America's most impressive cities was destroyed, its temples torn down, and colonial Mexico City was built in its place. This shows in all its harshness how the conquest not only changed rule, but also reshaped entire cultural worlds. Holy places were replaced by churches, Political elites were disempowered, property was redistributed, and social orders were radically changed. The conquest was not just a victory on the battlefield, but the beginning of a deep restructuring of society. A similar process took place a little later in the Inca Empire in South America. This empire was one of the largest political entities in the world at that time. It stretched over large parts of the Andes and had a sophisticated road network, administrative structures, storage economy, and a strong central power. When Francisco Pizarro invaded this area with a comparatively small Spanish force, he encountered an empire that had recently been weakened by a civil war. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, had fought for dominion, and the empire was torn apart. Here, too, it became clear that the Spaniards did not encounter a static world, but political constellations in which conflicts already existed. Pizarro acted with extreme unscrupulousness. In 1532, he succeeded in luring the Inca ruler Atahualpa into a trap in Cajamarca and capturing him. Although Atahualpa later paid a huge ransom in gold and silver, he was still executed. This process makes the logic of the Conquista visible in a particularly naked form. It was not about a fair war, not about diplomacy on an equal footing, and not about mutual recognition. It was about deception, blackmail, violence, and maximum exploitation of every situation. The Spaniards conquered a huge empire with a few hundred men because they combined military surprise, internal weakness of the enemy, and unscrupulous tactics. But even in Peru, it was not only the direct violence that helped the Spaniards. A decisive factor was diseases, especially smallpox, which reached the American continent before or during many direct contacts. These diseases often spread faster than Europeans themselves, causing enormous population losses. In the Inca Empire, they contributed to political destabilization because they weakened rulers, elites, and communities. This shows that the conquest of America was never just a military event. It was also a biological catastrophe. Disease became an invisible but devastating ally of the conquerors. The conquistadors themselves often saw their success as proof of divine favor. In their reports, they stylized themselves as courageous men who defeated enormous empires with few forces. This narrative was useful for the Spanish crown because it strengthened the imperial claim. But in truth, the success was far more complex. Although the Spaniards had technological advantages in certain areas, such as steel weapons, firearms, horses, and armor, these alone do not explain the rapid conquest. Firearms were still slow and often unreliable, and the Spaniards were usually far outnumbered. The decisive factor was the interplay of many factors: local alliances, political crises, the psychological effect of new means of war, illness, and the ability to strike with brutal determination. After the military victory, the establishment of colonial rule began. The Spanish crown had to transform the territories conquered by conquistadors into a permanent system. To this end, viceroyalty was established, administrations were established, cities were founded, and the country was reorganized. The conquistadors hoped for rewards in the form of land, titles, and labor. A central instrument was the encomienda system. Spaniards were given the right to demand tributes and work from indigenous communities, officially in return for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, this system often led to severe exploitation. Many indigenous people were forced to work in mines, in fields, or in other colonial projects. The difference between compulsory tribute and forced labor was often small. Silver mining in particular became of enormous importance for the Spanish colonial empire. Places like Potosí in present-day Bolivia developed into centers of a vast commodity system that supplied Spain and Europe with enormous amounts of precious metal. However, this wealth was only possible because indigenous workers were used under extremely harsh conditions. The silver from America flowed to Europe, financing wars, trade, and monarchical power, but its origin lay in exploitation and suffering. The conquest of new worlds, then, meant not only political control, but also the incorporation of America into a global economic system based on inequality. At the same time, religion played a central role. Missionaries accompanied the conquest and were supposed to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. In the eyes of many Spaniards, this was a sacred mission. But mission was closely linked to domination. Churches were built on the ruins of ancient temples, traditional beliefs were suppressed, and new religious orders were introduced. Although some missionaries later campaigned for better protection of the indigenous people, Christianization was part of the colonial project overall. It served not only faith, but also cultural control. Within Spain, the conquest was not without debate. Early on, the question arose as to whether the treatment of the indigenous population was morally justified. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas sharply criticized the cruelty of the colonial masters and denounced massacres, forced labor, and dehumanization. This criticism shows that even at that time not everyone took the conquista for granted or just. There were conflicts of conscience, theological debates, and attempts to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. But this criticism initially changed little in the basic structures of colonial rule. The conquest of new worlds thus created new empires. Spain became a global power in the 16th century, with dominions spanning Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia. America's treasures strengthened the monarchy, colonial possessions expanded its influence, and control over vast territories made the empire a historical exception. But this empire was based on violence and inequality. Its greatness was not only an expression of political wisdom or military strength, but also the result of the destruction of other empires. It is precisely here that the real scope of the conquista becomes apparent. The Spaniards did not simply conquer empty spaces. They destroyed existing empires, replaced their elites, took over their infrastructures, and forced their populations into a new system. The Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire did not simply disappear from history, but were actively torn down and transformed into colonial orders. The towns, roads, fields, and labor often remained, but they now served other masters and other purposes. Empire replaced empire, but the direction of power shifted across the Atlantic. When we look at the conquistadors today, it is tempting to see them as extraordinary individual figures. Names like Cortés or Pizarro still seem dramatic and almost mythical today. But they were not the only decisive factors. They were tools and at the same time profiteers of a larger process. Behind them stood the Spanish state, religious justifications, economic interests, and a worldview that considered conquest legitimate. Their deeds were spectacular, but they only became so historically effective because they were embedded in an emerging empire. Chapter 9 shows the transformation of the Age of Discovery into an age of imperial violence. Explorers became conquerors, encounters became subjugation, new coasts became colonies. The conquistadors and the empires they built fundamentally changed America and placed Europe in a new, powerful position within world history. But this rise came at a high price. It was based on the destruction of empires, on the exploitation of people, and on the presumption of being allowed to rearrange foreign worlds in the name of crown, cross, and gold. Precisely for this reason, the conquest of new worlds should not be misunderstood as a mere adventure. It was an upheaval of global significance, but also an act of enormous historical injustice. The successes of the conquistadors reflect courage, strategy, and determination, but also greed, cruelty, and arrogance. Therein lies the whole ambivalence of this epoch. The world was more closely connected, but at the same time measured anew with blood and suffering. Chapter 10: Global Trade begins. With the voyages of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, not only the geographical knowledge of the people changed fundamentally, but also the structure of trade. What had previously consisted of many regional and super-regional networks was now increasingly connected to form a global system. This does not mean that there was no long-distance trade before the Age of Discovery. On the contrary, long before Columbus, Vasco da Gama, or Magellan, extensive trade relations existed between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Goods, ideas, technologies, and religious ideas were exchanged via the Silk Road, caravan routes, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. But with the European sea routes across the Atlantic and around Africa, a new phase began. Now continents have been more directly connected, trade flows have been reorganized, and the foundations for an early form of globalization have been laid. Global trade did not start on a single day, but developed from a series of upheavals. Crucially, for the first time, European powers were able to establish lasting maritime links between distant regions. Portugal created direct access to the markets of the Indian Ocean by sea to India. Spain connected Europe with America with its voyages across the Atlantic. These two movements changed the world in a profound way, because they created trade axes through which not only luxury goods, but over time entire economic systems were linked with each other. Prior to this development, Europe was economically integrated into large trade networks, but it did not control them. Spices from India or Southeast Asia reached European markets via Arab, Persian, and Mediterranean intermediaries. Gold from Africa, silk from China, or gemstones from India went through complex chains of transport and brokerage. Each station increased the price, and many European rulers and merchants perceived this dependence as a disadvantage. This is exactly where the effort to create direct access grew. Global trade, as it emerged in the Age of Discovery, was therefore closely linked from the beginning to the desire to eliminate middlemen and gain control over the trade routes themselves. For Portugal, direct trade with India and Southeast Asia was initially primarily a spice project. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were highly sought after in Europe and promised enormous profits. When Portuguese ships were able to bring these goods to Europe by direct sea, the economic balance shifted. The Atlantic Ocean became more important, and Portuguese ports became important hubs of a new long-distance trade system. But Portugal did not stop at the mere transport of goods. It established bases, port fortresses, and trading posts along the African and Asian coasts. This created a network with which it tried not only to use trade, but to actively steer it. Spain, on the other hand, developed a different model in the Atlantic region. While Portugal relied more heavily on maritime trade control, a system based on conquest, land grabbing, and raw material extraction emerged in Spanish America. Gold and silver became particularly important. It became apparent early on that the American colonies could supply enormous quantities of precious metals. The silver mines in Mexico and the Andes region in particular developed into central pillars of the Spanish Empire. The silver from places such as Potosi or Zacatecas flowed in huge quantities to Europe and became the engine of economic processes there. It financed wars, strengthened monarchies, facilitated trade, and at the same time connected Europe more closely with Asia, because a large part of the silver was later used in trade with China and other Asian markets. This is precisely what shows how global this new trading system already was. Silver from America was disembarked in Europe, from where some were transported to Asia and exchanged there for spices, silk, porcelain, or other goods. Europe was therefore not only a recipient of American raw materials and Asian luxury goods, but also a mediator in an increasingly interconnected world economic area. A particularly impressive connection was created across the Pacific. Through the Spanish Philippines, a trade route was created that directly connected America with Asia. The so-called Manila galleons transported silver from Mexico to Asia and brought goods back from there. This was the first time that a trade cycle had been created that permanently connected the Americas, Europe, and Asia. This is precisely where the real beginning of global trade is shown. However, this trade included much more than precious metals and spices. Over time, more and more products became part of these new entanglements. Sugar played a particularly important role in this. On islands such as Madeira and later, especially in the Caribbean and Brazil, plantation farms sprang up, producing sugar on a large scale for the European market. Sugar was initially a luxury good, but as production grew, it increasingly became a mass product. Its economic importance was enormous, but it had a dark foundation. In many regions, sugar cultivation was based on the work of enslaved people from Africa. This makes it clear that global trade was not only an exchange system of goods, but also a system of human exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade became a central part of the nascent global economy. Millions of Africans were forcibly abducted, transported across the Atlantic and sold in the Americas. Though they had to work under often the most cruel conditions on plantations, in mines, or in households. The trade in enslaved people was closely linked to other trade flows. European traders brought goods to the African coasts, exchanged them for people, transported them to America, and returned to Europe with sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, or other colonial products. This so-called triangular trade was not an exactly closed triangle in every single case, but it describes very well how closely Europe, Africa, and America became economically connected. This brought about a new quality of trade. Before the Age of Discovery, long-distance trade was mostly limited to certain high-value goods that were transported in relatively small quantities. Now, however, forms of trade emerged that geared entire regions towards production for distant markets. In America, large areas were used for sugar, tobacco, or later cotton. In Africa, political and economic structures changed under the pressure of the slave trade. In Europe, on the other hand, the demand for colonial goods increased, and ports such as Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London developed into centers of ever denser world trade. Global trade therefore meant not only more exchange, but a profound restructuring of entire societies. Consumer habits also changed. Spices, sugar, cocoa, coffee, tea, tobacco, and many other products became part of everyday European life, or at least of the upper world. What was initially exotic and rare became more widespread over time. These goods changed eating habits, social rituals, and economic expectations. Global trade thus became not only a phenomenon of merchants and kings, but also shaped people's daily lives. Even those who never saw a ship could come into contact with goods in Europe that came from other continents. In a way, the world became present in everyday life. But the beginning of global trade was not peaceful networking among equals. It was characterized by power, violence, and unequal conditions. European powers used their maritime superiority, weapons, and state organization to enforce trade advantages. Portugal attacked existing networks in the Indian Ocean and tried to take control of important ports and sea routes. Spain established colonial empires in America, whose economy was based on forced labor. Later, the Netherlands, England, and France also entered this competition and created their own trading companies, colonies, and power structures. Global trade thus did not emerge as a neutral network, but as a struggle for control, monopolies, and profits. A particularly important step in this development was the emergence of large trading companies and new forms of finance. As long-distance trade became more and more extensive, individual merchants or small groups were often no longer sufficient to bear the enormous costs and risks. Therefore, new forms of economic organization emerged. Investments were bundled, profits and losses were distributed, insurance policies were developed, and credit structures were expanded. Later, powerful trading companies such as the Dutch East India Company or the English East India Company became central players in world trade. Even though these developments reached their peak a little later, they have their roots in the trade upheaval of the Age of Discovery. Global trade therefore needed not only ships and ports, but also new economic thinking. With this development, the center of power in Europe also shifted. While in the Middle Ages many trade flows ran across the Mediterranean, the Atlantic coastal states now gained in importance. Portugal and Spain were the first big winners of this postponement, followed later by the Netherlands and England. Cities on the Atlantic became hubs of trade, while traditional centers in the Mediterranean region lost relative importance. This geographical shift had far-reaching political consequences. Those who controlled trade gained wealth, and wealth strengthened military and state power. Global trade was therefore not only an economic phenomenon, but also a geopolitical one. At the same time, this trade connected the world not only through goods, but also through knowledge, plants, animals, and diseases. The so-called Columbian Exchange brought corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa to Europe, while wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and sheep made their way to America. These transfers changed agriculture, nutrition, and ecology on several continents. Some regions experienced an economic boom due to new crops, others were burdened by monocultures, deforestation, or soil exploitation. Here, too, it becomes clear that global trade was not an abstract process, but deeply intervened in nature and society. For many people, however, this change did not mean prosperity, but dependence. Indigenous communities in America lost land and were forced to do forced labor. Enslaved Africans were treated as commodities and brutally exploited. Even in Europe, not everyone benefited equally. Although wealth and consumption grew in some classes, many workers, sailors, and ordinary city dwellers continued to live in insecure conditions. Global trade did not automatically create general improvement. He created wealth, but he distributed it very unequally. From the beginning, the New World economy was characterized by hierarchies. Another important aspect is that global trade also changed the way we think about the world. When goods from India, silver from America, slaves from Africa, and textiles from Europe became part of the same system, there was gradually an awareness that the continents were more interconnected than ever before. Traders, rulers, scholars, and missionaries began to think in larger spaces. Maps, reports, and statistics gained in importance. The world no longer appeared as the sum of separate regions, but as a structure of relationships. This thinking was an important step towards the modern idea of the global economy. Nevertheless, this global economy remained fragile for a long time. Ships could sink, pirates and rival powers threatened trade, disease decimated crews, and political conflicts could quickly block trade routes. Global trade was therefore not stable from the beginning, but had to be constantly secured, defended, and organized. This is precisely why European powers are increasingly resorting to military means. Trade routes were armed, ports fortified, fleets expanded. Trade and war were often two sides of the same coin. Those who wanted to act often had to secure their interests by force. This connection between trade and domination is perhaps the most important point of this chapter. Global trade began not simply as a peaceful exchange across oceans, but as a system based on colonialism, coercion, and inequality. Europe benefited in particular because it was able to expand its position through maritime power and imperial expansion. Other regions were not only integrated, but often subordinated. Africa was wounded by the slave trade, America was colonially reshaped, and Asia was increasingly confronted with aggressive European trade strategies. The beginning of global trade was therefore also the beginning of a new world order in which economic interdependence and political dominance went hand in hand. And yet this trial was of historic significance. For the first time in history, the major regions of the world were connected in a permanently functioning network of exchange relations. Goods circulated between continents. Money flows connected mines in the Andes with markets in China, plantations in the Caribbean with consumers in Europe, and African coasts with American colonies. These unions were often violent and unjust, but they were real and irrevocably changed the world. Regional trading areas became an early world economy. Chapter 10 thus marks a decisive turning point in the Age of Discovery. The great voyages led not only to new maps and coasts, but also to a reorganization of economic relations between the continents. Global trade began as a system of shipping routes, commodity flows, plantations, ports, and markets. It brought wealth, innovation, and new ways of consumption, but also enslavement, exploitation, and profound inequality. When we talk about globalization today, we often think of modern technologies, global markets, and digital networking. But its early roots lie in exactly this era. Global trade began in the sails of Portuguese and Spanish ships, in the mines of America, in the ports of Africa and Asia, and in the offices of European merchants. It began with hope for profit, with claims to power, and with a new understanding of the world as a coherent space. And he left behind structures whose consequences continue to the present day. Chapter 11: Encounter of Cultures, Exchange and Conflict. The Age of Discovery was not only an era of ships, maps, and trade routes. Above all, it was also a time of intense encounters between people who had previously mostly lived in separate worlds. Europeans encountered societies in Africa, Asia, and America that had their own languages, religions, political orders, and traditions. These encounters were often characterized by curiosity, amazement, and practical exchange, but they almost never took place under equal conditions. Wherever European powers appeared in the name of trade, mission, or domination, a field of tension arose between rapprochement and violence, mutual learning, and deep misunderstanding. Precisely for this reason, this chapter of the Age of Discovery cannot simply be told as a story of cultural enrichment. It is also the story of conflict, coercion, and inequality. When cultures meet, never just one thing happens. There is always observation, interpretation, and change at the same time. People compare the foreign with the familiar, look for similarities, emphasize differences, and try to classify the new in their own world. In the Age of Discovery, this is exactly what happened on a scale never seen before. European sailors, traders, soldiers, and missionaries came to distant regions with performances that were shaped by religion, economic hopes, and old stories. There they met people who in turn tried to understand the strangers. Translations, misunderstandings, alliances, conflicts, and new mixed forms of coexistence emerged. Encounters were therefore never just peaceful contact, but a process full of tensions. Even the first contacts in America clearly show this ambivalence. When Columbus and his men met the inhabitants of the Caribbean, there was initially cautious curiosity in many places. Europeans were amazed by new landscapes, unknown plants, foreign forms of jewelry, and other ways of life. The indigenous communities, in turn, encountered men whose clothing, weapons, ships, and animals were foreign to them. In such situations, there were often exchanges, gestures of rapprochement, and attempts to deal peacefully with each other. But this openness was fragile from the outset, because both sides did not pursue the same goals. The Europeans wanted information, gold, influence, and often soon also domination. Thus, the encounter quickly turned into a relationship that was determined by questions of power. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to only see the conflicts. In fact, the clash of cultures led to an intensive exchange. Plants, animals, food, clothing, handicraft techniques, medical knowledge, and linguistic elements moved between the continents. Europeans learned about new crops such as corn, potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, and cocoa from the indigenous peoples of the Americas. These plants changed the diet on other continents in the long term. Conversely, Europeans brought wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and sheep to America, where they fundamentally changed landscapes, agriculture, and mobility. The same applies to encounters in Africa and Asia, where trade contacts imparted not only goods but also knowledge of navigation, medicinal plants, textiles, spices, and local markets. Cultural contact, therefore, always meant an exchange of knowledge. Language was a particularly important area. Where people want to act, negotiate, proselytize, or rule, they have to talk to each other. That is why interpreters were of enormous importance. They were key figures in many regions of the Age of Discovery. They not only bridged language barriers, but also helped to interpret cultural codes, gestures, and political intentions. Without such intermediaries, many expeditions would have failed or turned violent even faster. At the same time, their role shows how much encounter depended on translation. And every translation also changes what is understood. What is self-evident in one language can sound completely different in another. Many conflicts therefore arose not only from ill will, but also from misunderstandings, false expectations, and cultural misinterpretations. This dynamic is particularly impressive where new mixed cultures have emerged. In the colonial societies of the Americas, but also in parts of Africa and Asia, spaces were formed in which people of different origins lived together, often under difficult conditions. Europeans, indigenous populations, enslaved Africans, and their descendants had complex relationships with each other. This gave rise to new languages, new religious practices, new forms of music, nutrition, and everyday culture. Many of these developments were the result of adaptation, survival, and creative handling of violent relations. Mixed cultures did not emerge in a peaceful laboratory, but often in colonial spaces marked by inequality. Nevertheless, they show that encounters never only produce destruction. Even under pressure, people developed new cultural forms. Religion was a central area of cultural encounter. For many Europeans, the spread of Christianity was an important goal of expansion. Missionaries accompanied traders and conquerors, founded churches, learned local languages, and tried to convert the people. In their own view, they often acted in the service of salvation. In fact, some missionaries also brought with them education, writing, or protection from particularly brutal colonial masters. But the mission was almost never neutral. It was closely linked to domination. Those who convert others usually declare their previous forms of faith to be wrong or inferior. This is exactly what happened in many regions during the Age of Discovery. Indigenous religions were suppressed, holy places destroyed, rituals banned, and religious elites disempowered. Christianity thus came not only as a faith, but often as an instrument of cultural transformation. At the same time, this process was never completely one-sided. In many regions, Christian elements were combined with local traditions. People absorbed new religious symbols, but interpreted them in their own way. This is how syncretic forms of faith emerged, in which European, African, and indigenous ideas merged with each other. Saints took on new meanings, festivals were reshaped, rituals combined different traditions. Such hybrid forms show that cultural encounters remained creative even where they took place under duress. Oppressed people preserved parts of their own world by transforming them into new forms. This is precisely where a silent but important form of resistance lies. But the exchange between cultures has always been permeated by unequal power relations. European powers usually did not come as equal partners, but with weapons, trade interests, and the claim of cultural superiority. Many Europeans did not regard the societies they encountered as equal, but as backward, pagan, or malleable. This attitude facilitated exploitation and domination. When a culture is considered inferior, it seems easier to suppress or dominate it. Thus, encounters quickly turned into conflicts. What started as a trade often became a control. What began as a mission became a cultural coercive order. What began as contact ended in war or expropriation. Especially in America, the consequences were dramatic. There, cultural encounters met military conquest, disease, and colonial reorganization. Entire societies were not only politically defeated, but also put under cultural pressure. Languages disappeared, memories were suppressed, forms of education were destroyed, and sacred traditions were fought. Nevertheless, many elements of indigenous cultures survived in a modified form. They lived on in stories, customs, place names, agricultural knowledge, and family practices. This shows that cultural encounters are never just an either-or. Even in moments of deepest destruction, traces, adaptations, and resistance remain. In Africa, too, encounters between Europeans and local societies were multi-layered. Trade contacts were established on the coasts of West Africa, in which both sides were initially dependent on each other. Europeans need local intermediaries, protection, and access to markets. African rulers and traders, in turn, used the contact to pursue their own political and economic interests. This gave rise to alliances, competition, and new power constellations. But with the expansion of the slave trade, this relationship became increasingly destructive. The trade in enslaved people transformed contact zones into spaces of extreme violence. European demand and African power conflicts reinforced each other, and entire regions suffered from depopulation, insecurity, and social disruption. Here, too, cultural encounters were therefore closely linked to economic coercion. In Asia, the situation was different again. There, Europeans encountered empires and trading worlds that were often equal or superior to them in political, economic, and cultural terms. India, China, Japan, and the Islamic trading areas of the Indian Ocean were not passive recipients of European influences. They had strong traditions, complex administrations, and great economic dynamism. As a result, Europeans often had to adapt, negotiate, and learn there. In Asia, too, mission, conflict, and violence occurred, but cultural encounters were more reciprocal in many regions than in America. European traders adopted local customs, learned languages, and had to adapt to existing trade regulations. This shows that the form of the encounter depended heavily on the political and social structures that Europeans encountered. Another important aspect is the perception of the foreign. Encounter always means creating images of the other. In the age of discovery, countless reports, drawings, and descriptions of foreign peoples were created. These depictions were often characterized by amazement, but also by prejudice. Some described foreign societies as noble, innocent, or close to nature, others as barbaric, cruel, or backward. Such images serve not only to provide information, but also to confirm Europe's self-affirmation. By describing the foreign as different and inferior, one could present one's own culture as superior. At the same time, exotic images were used to promote curiosity, fascination, and colonial projects. Cultural encounters have therefore always been a question of representation and interpretation. On the other side, too, pictures of the stranger were created. For many indigenous societies, Europeans were initially mysterious phenomena. They came from the sea, brought unknown animals, objects, and diseases with them, and often behaved aggressively and unpredictably. Some were initially classified as religious or mythical ideas. Others were seen as potential allies or threats. Here, too, the encounter was characterized by attempts at interpretation. But because the Europeans soon often gained the upper hand militarily and politically, in the end it was above all their images that shaped the written history. Many views of the subjugated societies have only been preserved indirectly or fragmentarily. The conflicts that arose from these encounters were therefore not only military, but also cultural. It was about language, faith, education, family regulations, clothing, work, and ideas of law. Colonial rule almost always meant an attempt to change other people's everyday lives. Children should be brought up differently, rituals should be abandoned, clothing should be adapted, and working methods should be reshaped. This is precisely where it becomes clear how deep the intervention went. Cultural contact was not just a moment on the coast or in the market, but penetrated into the most intimate areas of life. And yet this epoch also produced new forms of world knowledge. Through the encounter of cultures, people learned more about other continents, ways of life, and worldviews. European scholars gained knowledge about new plants, healing methods, languages, and societies. Other regions of the world also took up and transformed European techniques, products, or ideas. Encounters thus led not only to domination, but also to a broadening of horizons. People became more aware that the world was more diverse than they had long assumed. However, this new knowledge was usually unevenly distributed and often distorted by power interests. When we look at the meeting of cultures in the age of discovery today, we must therefore think of both sides together. There was exchange, learning, adaptation, and creative mixing. New foods, new forms of expression, new religious mixtures, and new social realities emerged. At the same time, this process was characterized by violence, expropriation, proselytizing, and cultural devaluation. Encounters were rarely peaceful and almost never equal. This is precisely where its historical significance lies. For it is from these tensions that the modern world emerged, a world in which cultures are more closely connected than ever before, but also a world marked by colonial wounds, inequalities, and conflict-ridden memories. Chapter 11 thus makes it clear that the age of discovery not only overcame the oceans, but also made human borders visible. It showed how difficult it is to really understand the foreign, and how quickly encounter can turn into mastery. At the same time, however, it also shows the amazing ability of people to create meaning, share knowledge, and survive culturally under new conditions. Exchange and conflict were not opposites, but two sides of the same historical process. Thus, the encounter of cultures in the Age of Discovery was neither just a story of enrichment nor just a story of destruction. She was both at the same time. In it, curiosity and violence, learning and domination, rapprochement and extinction lie close together. This is precisely why it is one of the central experiences of this era. If you want to understand the Age of Discovery, you have to recognize that its real drama lay not only in the oceans, but in the human encounters that these oceans made possible. Chapter 12: The Consequences for Indigenous Peoples. The Age of Discovery is often told from the perspective of European seafarers, rulers, and traders. The focus is then on ships, maps, new trade routes, and famous names such as Columbus, Cortez, or Vasco da Gama. But such a narrative remains incomplete if it does not take into account the people for whom this epic meant above all loss, destruction, and profound upheaval. For indigenous peoples in the Americas and other parts of the world, the discoveries of Europe were not romantic adventures, but often the beginning of a catastrophe. Their living spaces, political orders, religious traditions, and social structures were shaken by conquest, disease, forced labor, and cultural oppression. This is precisely why this chapter is one of the most important of the entire topic. For it is only in the consequences for indigenous peoples that the human costs of the Age of Discovery become fully apparent. When Europeans arrived in America, they did not encounter an empty or disorganized world at all. The continent was characterized by an impressive diversity of societies. There were great empires such as the Aztecs or the Incas, but also countless smaller political communities, tribal associations, urban societies, and regional cultures. Many had complex knowledge of agriculture, medicine, architecture, astronomy, and political organization. People lived in different environments and had each found their own ways of dealing with them. Some built large cities, others lived in smaller, more mobile communities. There was an enormous linguistic and cultural diversity. It was precisely this world that was struck to its foundations by the arrival of the Europeans. Perhaps the most devastating consequence was the spread of disease. Europeans brought smallpox, measles, influenza, typhoid fever, and other infections to America against which the indigenous population had no immunity. These diseases often spread faster than the conquerors themselves. Even before some regions were reached directly by Europeans, pathogens could be passed on through trade contacts or migratory movements. The result was a mass extinction of unimaginable proportions. In many areas, the population collapsed dramatically within a few decades. Entire villages were depopulated, families wiped out, political and religious elites died, and communities lost their bearers of knowledge, language, and memory. This demographic catastrophe was more than just a medical event. It hit indigenous societies to the core. When a large part of the population dies in a short time, not only people disappear, but also structures. Fields remain uncultivated, rituals can no longer be carried out, ruling systems break down, children grow up without parents, and collective knowledge is lost. In many regions, the disease therefore also meant political and cultural collapse. For European conquerors, this often seemed like a sign of their own superiority or as proof that God was on their side. But in truth, it was a biological catastrophe that radically distorted the balance of power and in many cases made the conquest possible on this scale. In addition to diseases, indigenous peoples were also hit by direct military violence. The conquests by the conquistadors were marked by massacres, sieges, executions, and destruction. Resistance was often met with extreme harshness. Cities were torn down, political leaders captured or killed, and communities forced into submission. Even where alliances or negotiations were initially formed, violence was never far away. European weapons, horses, military tactics, and above all, the ruthlessness of many conquerors led to indigenous societies falling into a state of permanent threat. Those who resisted risked annihilation. Those who submitted often lost their freedom and land. Military victory usually marked the beginning of a second, more long-term form of destruction, the colonial reorganization of life. Land that indigenous communities had often used for generations or centuries was claimed and redistributed by European powers. The Spanish crown, Portuguese colonial rulers, or later other European powers treated entire regions as if they could freely dispose of them. For indigenous peoples, this meant dispossession. Their fields, forests, hunting grounds, and settlement areas were declared the property of colonists, orders, or the crown. This not only meant that the economic basis was lost, but often also the spiritual connection to the country. In many indigenous cultures, land was not just a possession, but part of one's own identity, history, and religious order. His removal was therefore a particularly deep intervention. A central element of colonial rule was forced labor. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, indigenous people were used to work in mines, on plantations, in workshops, or in the construction of roads, churches, and cities. Systems such as the encomienda or the mita were often formally presented as a regulated obligation to work or tribute, but in practice they often led to severe exploitation. People had to work under the harshest conditions, received little protection, and were further weakened by hunger, abuse, and overwork. Especially in mines like Potosí, many died of exhaustion, illness, and the brutality of the working conditions. The economic basis of colonial wealth was thus closely linked to the suffering of indigenous populations. But it did not stop at material exploitation. The social structures of indigenous communities have also been profoundly changed. European colonial powers often tried to replace traditional leadership systems with their own administration or to integrate existing elites into colonial orders. Local rulers, tribal leaders, or religious authorities lost power or were deliberately used as mediators. Family structures, successions, and forms of cohabitation came under pressure. In some regions, people were forcibly resettled in order to be able to control or proselytize them more easily. Such interventions destroyed social networks and made many communities dependent on colonial institutions. The consequences were often long-term. Even where indigenous identities have been preserved, the conditions for their continued existence have changed radically. Cultural and religious oppression also had a particularly deep effect. Missionaries came to many regions with the aim of converting people to Christianity. From their point of view, this was often an act of salvation. For indigenous peoples, however, it often meant the devaluation or displacement of their own belief systems. Holy places were destroyed or built over with churches, religious festivals were banned, spiritual leaders were persecuted, and traditional rituals were condemned as pagan or demonic. In doing so, colonial rule attacked not only people's bodies and possessions, but also their interpretation of the world. In many societies, religion was closely linked to nature, community, the understanding of time, and political order. Their oppression, therefore, had a deep impact on all areas of life. Language was also a field of loss. Many indigenous languages were pushed back or disappeared completely in the course of the colonial period. Some missionaries learned local languages in order to be able to better proselytize, and thus paradoxically contributed to the written recording of some languages. In the long term, however, European colonial languages prevailed in many regions, especially Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French. With the loss of a language, however, much more is lost than a means of communication. It contains stories, memories, worldviews, concepts for nature and community, in short, a whole way of understanding the world. When languages die, parts of cultural identity often die as well. In addition, there was the symbolic devaluation of indigenous cultures. European colonizers often viewed the societies they encountered as inferior, barbaric, or childish. This view helped to justify rule morally. Those who classify others as uncivilized can more easily claim that their subjugation or re-education is necessary. This attitude developed into a colonial way of thinking that systematically devalued indigenous people. Their religions were considered superstition, their political orders inadequate, their ways of life backward. Such judgments were not only opinions, but had concrete consequences. They determined laws, forms of education, property rights, and everyday interaction. The consequences of this devaluation continue to the present day, as many indigenous communities are still fighting against discrimination and against images created in the colonial era. Despite all this violence and destruction, however, it would be wrong to think of indigenous peoples as passive victims. They resisted, in very different ways. Some fought militarily against the conquerors, formed alliances or organized uprisings. Others sought diplomatic paths, adapted outwardly, but inwardly preserved their traditions. Still others combined new and old elements to survive under changed conditions. Resistance could be open or hidden, collective or individual, violent or cultural. The ability of many indigenous communities to preserve identity, memory, and cohesion under extreme pressure is one of the most impressive aspects of this history. In many regions, hybrid forms emerged in which indigenous traditions lived on despite colonial rule. Religious festivals were associated with Christian symbols, old stories were passed on in a new guise, local healing methods were secretly practiced, or traditional forms of community life were preserved in a different form. Many elements also survived in language, art, music, and everyday knowledge. This shows that cultural annihilation never succeeded completely. Colonial rule was powerful, but people found ways to carry on their world under new conditions. This persistence does not mean that the losses were small, but it does mean that indigenous history is also a story of perseverance and self-assertion. The consequences of the Age of Discovery were not limited to the early colonial period. Many structures that were created at that time still have an impact today. Land loss, social inequality, racist hierarchies, political marginalization, and cultural discrimination still shape the lives of indigenous communities in many countries. In Latin America, North America, Australia, and other regions of the world, indigenous groups are still fighting for recognition, language rights, land rights, and historical justice. The expropriation of their ancestors is often not simply a thing of the past, but is perpetuated in property relations, state borders, and social inequalities of the present. This makes it clear that the consequences of the Age of Discovery are not over. This legacy is also controversial in the collective memory. For a long time, many European and American societies told the story of discoveries and conquests primarily as a story of progress. The suffering of indigenous peoples was often suppressed or trivialized. Only in recent times have those perspectives that point to loss, violence, and cultural destruction come to the fore. This change is important because it makes the story more complete. If you only tell the European side, you don't really understand the era. For indigenous peoples, the Age of Discovery was often the age of dying, disenfranchisement, and uprooting. At the same time, the diversity of indigenous experiences must not be overlooked. Not all regions were hit at the same time, with the same intensity or in the same way. Some communities were destroyed or greatly reduced early on, others remained relatively autonomous for centuries, and still others entered into new political alliances or used colonial structures to their advantage as far as possible. The history of indigenous peoples in the Age of Discovery is therefore not a unified narrative, but a mosaic of very different experiences. It is precisely this diversity that should remain visible, so that one does not fall into a simplistic view again. So when we ask about the consequences for indigenous peoples, we are talking about a profound historical break. Diseases killed millions. Conquest destroyed political orders. Forced labor robbed them of their freedom and life. Missionary work attacked religious worlds. Land grabbing separated people from their homeland. Language and memory were threatened. At the same time, however, many communities survived, resisted, and carried on their culture for centuries. It is in this tension between loss and perseverance that the real depth of this chapter lies. Chapter 12 thus reminds us of a fundamental truth about the Age of Discovery. What often appears to Europe as a new beginning, an expansion of knowledge, and the beginning of global networking was an experience of extreme violence for many indigenous peoples. Their world was not simply touched, but radically transformed. The price of European expansion was paid to a considerable extent by them. This is precisely why it is so important not to treat their perspective as a side note, but to place it at the center of historical consideration. Because without the history of the indigenous peoples, the picture of the Age of Discovery remains distorted. Only when we also see their losses, their struggles and their survival do we understand the whole truth of this era, that the discovery of some was often the wounding of others. Chapter 13: Science, Maps and the New Worldview. The Age of Discovery not only changed trade routes, empires and power relations. It also changed the way people think about the world. With every new journey, with every surveyed coast, with every report about foreign plants, animals, cities and peoples, the previous worldview began to falter. Europe entered an era in which maps were no longer just symbolic representations of the known Earth, but tools for orientation, domination, and knowledge. Science, observation, and geographical knowledge gained a new meaning. Old authorities were not immediately abolished, but they were increasingly measured by experience. That was a profound change. Because suddenly it became clear that the world was bigger, more diverse, and more complicated than many people had long assumed. Before the Age of Discovery, the European worldview was shaped by several sources. The writings of ancient scholars, especially Ptolemy, played an important role. His geographical ideas had influenced thinking about the Earth for centuries. In addition, there were biblical interpretations of the world, medieval travel reports, and the experiences of traders, pilgrims, and sailors. Many maps of the Middle Ages were therefore not only geographical aids, but also an expression of religious order. They often showed the Earth in symbolic form, with Jerusalem at the center or with a tripartite division into Europe, Asia, and Africa. Such representations made sense, but they were not designed to accurately depict unknown coasts or systematically depict new ocean routes. With the voyages of discovery, this gradually changed. Suddenly, coasts appeared that did not appear on older maps. Islands had to be redrawn, distances corrected, sea routes added, and cardinal directions determined more precisely. This initially concerned very practical questions. A captain had to know where the shoals were, how currents ran, and which ports were suitable for calling. But out of these practical needs came a much greater spiritual change. The world was now increasingly understood as a measurable space that could be observed, described, calculated, and mapped. Experience became an authority that stepped alongside the old books and sometimes contradicted them. Cartography, in particular, became a key to this development. In the Age of Discovery, maps were not just drawings, but concentrated knowledge. They combined observations by sailors, calculations by mathematicians, information from merchants, and the work of cartographers. In particular, the portolan charts, which were initially used primarily for navigation in the Mediterranean and on coasts, already showed a new form of spatial accuracy. With the expansion of seafaring, such charts had to be constantly supplemented. The coasts of Africa, America, and Asia took on a more concrete form. White spots on the maps remained for a long time, but the known world grew visibly. The card was never a neutral medium. Those who mapped not only ordered the world, but often also claimed it. Coastlines were given European names, islands were drawn in the dominion of a crown, and new regions were symbolically made available. Cards thus served not only knowledge, but also power. Naming, surveying, and classifying an area on a map was often the first step towards its political or economic access. In this sense, cartography was one of the most important tools of the imperial age. Science and rule went closely together. But it was precisely in this combination of knowledge and power that a new relationship to reality emerged. More and more often, older ideas had to be corrected. Columbus had still believed that he had reached Asia when he landed in the Caribbean. It was only after further journeys that it became clear that between Europe and Asia lay a continent that had previously been unknown from a European point of view. This finding was not only a geographical addition. It called into question the entire previous image of the Earth. If ancient authorities had not known such a vast continent, how certain was the traditional knowledge? This question was profound. It opened up a space in which observation and experience became increasingly important. This marked the beginning of a slow change towards a more modern scientific culture. Of course, the age of discoveries was not yet a time of the scientific method in the modern sense. Many reports were inaccurate, many maps were incorrect, and religious interpretations remained strong. But the trend was clear. People collected data, compared reports, improved maps, observed stars, measured angles, and documented plants, animals, and landscapes. Knowledge was increasingly understood as something that can be expanded and corrected. The Earth was no longer a perfectly known heritage of the ancients, but an open field of new knowledge. A particularly visible expression of this change was the development of world maps. In the course of the 16th century, depictions were created in which America became recognizable as a continent in its own right. The connection between the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans also became clearer. Expeditions such as those of Magellan and Elcano, which completed a circumnavigation of the Earth for the first time, showed with practical clarity how the oceans were connected to each other and how large the Earth actually is. Such experiences did not make the spherical shape of the Earth conceivable in the first place, but they made it vivid, measurable, and practically relevant. The world was no longer a mere theory, but a space that could actually be circumnavigated. These new maps also changed man's relationship to distance. Regions that had previously only existed as rumors, legends, or vague ideas were given contours. Archipelagos, coasts, and straits became objects of close observation. Of course, much remained unknown or misrepresented. For a long time, people believed in non-existent islands, recorded coastlines inaccurately, or left the interior of large continents largely empty. But the crucial point was that the world now appeared to be systematically explorable. This was a new view of the world. The Earth was bigger than expected, but it was not limitlessly chaotic. It was recognizable step by step. In addition to geography, natural history knowledge also changed. The encounter with new continents brought an abundance of unknown plants, animals, and raw materials to Europe. Corn, potatoes, cocoa, tobacco, tomatoes, and many other plants became not only economically important, but also scientifically interesting. Scholars, doctors, and nature observers began to describe, compare, and classify these new species. Animals such as turkeys, armadillos, or certain species of monkeys also expanded the European idea of the diversity of nature. Such discoveries were not just exotic curiosities. They forced people to rethink systems of order, similarities, and differences. Nature appeared more complex than the traditional classifications had often suggested. The same applied to the study of foreign cultures. Travelogues about the societies of America, Africa, and Asia spread throughout Europe and triggered amazement, irritation, and debate. How could one classify peoples who did not clearly appear in classical ancient knowledge or in the Christian tradition? What role did they play in divine creation? Were they civilized, wild, noble, or barbaric? Such questions were often answered in problematic ways, because European authors often evaluated other cultures according to their own standards. Nevertheless, a change was also evident here. The diversity of human life forms became more visible. This called into question the idea that one's own world was the sole measure of all things. At the same time, the importance of measurement and calculation grew. Seafaring required ever more precise knowledge of angles, time, latitude, distances, and speeds. Instruments such as the astrolabe, quadrant, or Jacob's staff have been improved and used more routinely. Mathematics and astronomy therefore gained a new practical value. Those who could calculate the world could move better in it. This combination of science and application was typical of the Age of Discovery. Knowledge was gathered not only to understand the world, but also to travel, trade, and dominate it. Letterpress printing also played an enormous role in this context. Travelogues, maps, geographical treatises, and descriptions of natural history could now be distributed in greater numbers than before. This meant that new knowledge did not only remain in the hands of individual courts or port administrations, but reached learned circles, trading cities, and universities. Printed works created a new public sphere of knowledge. People who had never traveled themselves could read about distant worlds and form ideas about their shape. Of course, many of these texts were exaggerated, biased, or inaccurate, but they contributed to the fact that the image of the world began to move. With the expansion of knowledge, Europe's attitude towards itself also changed. Before the great discoveries, Europe was only one part of a multi-layered network of Eurasian and African relations. However, with the development of new sea routes and continents, it began to increasingly see itself as an active center of global order. Maps often clearly reflected this new self-confidence. European standards, names, and interests structured the representation of the world. In this respect, the new worldview was not only more open, but also more Eurocentric. Europe now saw more of the world, but at the same time it ordered this world more strongly from its own perspective. Scientific progress was therefore not free of arrogance. It made knowledge possible, but it often also strengthened the claim to be allowed to define and dominate other spaces. A particularly fascinating aspect of this development is that the new scientific view did not immediately completely displace the old. Rather, different worldviews lived side by side for a while. Religious interpretations, ancient authorities, practical seafaring experience, and new empirical observations overlapped. A scholar could believe in divine providence at the same time and yet collect accurate measurement data. A mapmaker could adopt ancient terms and at the same time correctly draw a newly discovered coast. The new worldview was therefore not created by a sudden break, but by a slow shift of weights. Observation, experience, and verification became more important, without older patterns of interpretation disappearing immediately. It is precisely this transitional phase that makes the Age of Discovery so important for the history of knowledge. It was an epoch in which it became clear that the world is bigger than books, that experience can correct authorities, and that knowledge must be constantly expanded. This insight was fundamental for later developments in science. Without the geographical and natural history challenges of the Age of Discovery, the European culture of knowledge in the early modern period would probably have taken a different course. The confrontation with the unknown forced people to sharpen their methods and examine their certainties. But this progress, as so often in this era, had a double side. The same maps that made new knowledge possible were also used for conquest. The same natural history observations that broadened horizons were part of a system that incorporated raw materials, plants, and people into colonial orders. The same scientific curiosity that made diversity visible could lead to classifications that claimed superiority and subordination. Science and worldview were therefore not only instruments of enlightenment, but also means of imperial power. Nevertheless, the spiritual significance of this change remains enormous. The new worldview of the Age of Discovery was not just a larger map. It was a different view of the Earth and the place of man in it. The world now appeared as a coherent space in which oceans no longer only separate, but connect. Continents became related to each other, and knowledge was understood as something that could be expanded through travel, observation, and comparison. This idea was modern in the deep sense. It opened the door to a world in which certainties can be verified, maps can be changed, and horizons can be shifted. Chapter 13 therefore shows that the Age of Discovery was not only a political and economic upheaval, but also an intellectual one. Maps became more accurate, but with them also changed thinking. The Earth was measured, but at the same time people had to rearrange their ideas of truth, space, and order. Science gained in importance, not as an abstract field of theory, but as a practical means of understanding the world and acting in it. In this way, a new worldview emerged in the interplay of travel, measurements, reports, and maps. It was bigger, more mobile, and in many ways more realistic than the old one. But at the same time, it was shaped by the interests of the powers that opened up this new world. This is precisely where its historical significance and ambivalence lies. The world became more visible, but it was also co-opted. Knowledge grew, but it remained intertwined with power. Anyone who wants to understand the Age of Discovery must therefore recognize that his maps not only showed paths, but also formed a new way of thinking about the world. Chapter 14. Lights and Shadows of the Age of Discovery. The Age of Discovery is one of the most contradictory epochs in world history. Hardly any other time so obviously combines admiration and horror, progress and destruction, curiosity and violence. On the one hand, there are courageous seafaring, the expansion of geographical knowledge, new trade connections, and a growing awareness that the world is larger and more diverse than had long been assumed. On the other hand, there is conquest, enslavement, cultural oppression, disease, and the systematic exploitation of entire continents. Precisely for this reason, this age must neither be celebrated one-sidedly nor dealt with exclusively in simple moral judgments. If you want to understand it, you have to see both the light and the shadow. For the historical significance of this epoch lies precisely in its ambivalence. The light of the Age of Discovery shows itself first of all in the enormous expansion of the human horizon. Before Europe's great voyages, the world was by no means unknown, but many regions were only vaguely, indirectly, or incorrectly juxtaposed in European ideas. With the journeys across the Atlantic, around Africa, and finally around the whole world, this picture changed fundamentally. Continents were correlated, coasts were measured, oceans were recognized as transport routes, and the Earth could be experienced as a coherent space. This was an important step for the history of knowledge. Old errors were corrected, maps became more precise, and thinking about the world gained a new depth. People began to understand more strongly that their own experience was only a small part of a much larger reality. This broadening of horizons was also accompanied by a scientific impulse. Navigation, cartography, astronomy, and nature observation continued to develop because seafaring demanded new precision. Travel reports, drawings, maps, and natural history descriptions collected knowledge about plants, animals, landscapes, and societies. The encounter with other worlds forced Europe to examine old certainties. This was an important step towards a culture in which observation and experience were given more weight. Even though the Age of Discovery did not yet produce modern science in its later form, it did prepare for many developments that would become decisive for the early modern period. The world not only became bigger, but also more questionable in the productive sense. The known had to be measured against the unknown. Another bright aspect was the emergence of new connections between the continents. Never before have Europe, Africa, Asia, and America been involved in such enduring relations with each other as they have been since the 15th and 16th centuries. Goods, ideas, plants, animals, and technologies began to circulate on a large scale between the world's regions. New crops such as potatoes, corn, or tomatoes have changed nutrition and agriculture in many parts of the world in the long term. Other products such as sugar, cocoa, tea, coffee, or tobacco became global goods and shaped everyday life for centuries. In a way, the Age of Discovery marked the beginning of the interconnectedness of the world that is often referred to today as globalization. Continents that had previously been loosely connected to each other now became part of a common historical space. This development also had consequences on the level of human experience. People learned about new peoples, religions, landscapes, and ways of life. Even if much was misunderstood or presented in a biased way, there was still a growing awareness of the fact that the world is culturally diverse. Travel reports triggered amazement, aroused curiosity, and made it visible that there are other forms of coexistence, faith, and knowledge. This experience of the foreign could reinforce prejudices, but it could also open up the mind. Some European authors began to think about the relativity of their own habits. The encounter with other cultures indirectly posed the question of whether one's own was really the sole yardstick. Therein lies a quiet but important light of this era. And yet any admiration for these developments would be wrong if she overlooked the shadows. For the Age of Discovery was not only a time of learning and connecting, but also a time of submission. Europe usually did not meet other regions of the world on an equal footing, but with a claim to power. Trade was often associated with armed force, mission with cultural devaluation, discovery with land grabbing. In America, the arrival of the Europeans led to the destruction of entire empires and societies. In Africa, The European demand for enslaved people intensified existing conflicts and created new forms of suffering. In Asia, European powers aggressively interfered in ancient trading worlds and sought to gain control over markets and sea routes. So the light of global connection has always been accompanied by the shadow of imperial violence. This shadow is particularly evident in the treatment of indigenous peoples. For many of them, the Age of Discovery was not a time of progress, but of catastrophe. Diseases introduced by Europeans killed millions of people. Conquests destroyed political orders. Land grabbing separated communities from their livelihoods. Forced labor in mines and on plantations cost countless lives. Missionary work suppressed religious traditions and deeply interfered with cultural identity. Language, memory, and social structures were threatened or smashed. When Europe broadened its horizons, it was often at the expense of those whose world was wounded as a result. This is where the central moral tension of the epoch becomes apparent. The progress of some was often based on the suffering of others. The dark side is even clearer in the Atlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were abducted, sold, and forced to work under inhumane conditions. Their bodies were turned into commodities, their families torn apart, their dignity systematically violated. The wealth that sugar, cotton, tobacco, or other colonial products brought to Europe was based to a considerable extent on this violence. Global trade, which is often described as economic progress, has thus been associated with one of the greatest crimes in human history from the very beginning. Anyone who speaks of the beginning of the world economy must therefore never forget that it consisted not only of markets and ships, but also of chains, violence, and deprivation of rights. The shadow of the Age of Discovery is also evident in thinking itself. The encounter with other cultures led not only to knowledge, but also to the formation of new hierarchies. Many Europeans regarded the people they met as inferior, backward, or in need of civilization. Such ideas developed into a colonial worldview that morally justified rule. When other peoples appear to be savage or uncivilized, their subjugation is easier to portray as progress or divine mandate. In this sense, the Age of Discovery brought forth not only new cards, but also new forms of arrogance. The world became more visible, but at the same time it was ordered and evaluated by European standards. This ambivalence also affects the great figures of the era. Men like Columbus, Cortés, Pizarro, or Vasco da Gama often appear as heroes in older stories. Their rides and successes are admired, their determination highlighted. In some respects, her performances were indeed extraordinary. They dared to travel at enormous risk, expanded known spaces, and changed world history. But these same men were also part of violent relationships. They sought wealth, claimed domination, used weapons, turned people into subjugated people, and contributed to colonial structures, the consequences of which are still felt today. So it would be too easy to see them only as heroes or only as criminals. Rather, they embody the contradictions of their time in a particularly pointed form. Economically, too, the Age of Discovery bears this double face. On the one hand, it created new opportunities for trade, promoted technical innovations, strengthened port cities, and contributed to the emergence of modern financial and economic structures. It produced wealth, dynamism, and new forms of consumption. On the other hand, this upswing was often based on extreme inequality. Colonies were not developed for the local people, but exploited in the interests of European powers. Raw materials were withdrawn, workers were forced, production methods were geared to the needs of distant markets. Entire regions were made dependent. So early globalization created connection, but not justice. It distributed profits and burdens extremely unequally. This is precisely why it is problematic to describe the Age of Discovery solely with terms such as progress or civilization. Such words sound as if the history of the world has inevitably led to a higher state. But the reality was much more brutal. The new was not automatically better, and global networking was not automatically more human. In many cases, it meant the destruction of functioning living environments. Progress for some has been a step backwards for others. This contradiction must not be smoothed out. It belongs to the core of the era. However, it would be just as problematic to see only the shadow and describe the entire age as a pure history of crime, because that would not make you understand why this epoch became so powerful. Its dynamism lay precisely in the fact that it produced real discoveries, real increases in knowledge and profound connections. People learned from each other, plants and ideas changed continents, and the Earth as a whole could be experienced in a new way. The modern world, in which information, goods and people are related across continents, has one of its most important historical origins here. Anyone who wants to understand this origin must be prepared to acknowledge the greatness and the cruelty at the same time. Perhaps the most important lesson of this chapter lies precisely in the fact that history is rarely unambiguous. The Age of Discovery was not a fairy tale of human progress, nor was it a mere series of senseless cruelties. It was an epoch in which the possibilities of man became visible, for better or for worse. Humans have been able to cross unknown seas, recognize new spaces, expand knowledge, and create global connections. At the same time, they could enslave others, destroy cultures, plunder countries, and justify suffering. So the light and the shadow come from the same source, from human agency. That's exactly what makes this story so depressing and so significant. This ambivalence continues to have an effect today. Many modern achievements, such as global trade networks, scientific curiosity, or intercultural connections, have historical roots in this era. At the same time, many of today's problems go back to them. Colonial borders, economic inequality, racism, land conflicts, and the persistent discrimination against indigenous communities. The Age of Discovery is therefore not a closed past. It lives on in structures, languages, memories, and power relations. This is precisely why it is important to become aware of one's two-facedness. A mature view of this epoch therefore demands more than admiration or condemnation. He demands historical honesty. This includes recognizing the technical and intellectual achievements without concealing the violence. This includes understanding the global significance of the discoveries without suppressing the perspective of the victims. This also includes taking the intertwining of knowledge and power seriously. For the Age of Discovery shows like hardly any other epoch that progress is not innocent. It can broaden horizons and humiliate people at the same time. It can open up new paths and drive others into bondage. So when we speak of the light and shadow of the Age of Discovery, we must not separate the two. The light gains its sharpness precisely through the shadow, and the shadow only becomes intelligible against the background of real historical upheavals. The ships that sailed across the oceans carried science, trade, and curiosity on board, but also weapons, greed, and claims to power. The new maps of the world reflected knowledge and the will to possess at the same time. In the encounters of cultures, amazement and violence were closely intertwined. This close connection makes the Age of Discovery one of the most formative, but also morally most difficult epochs in history. So Chapter 14 leads us to a point of reflection. After all the travels, conquests, trade routes, and encounters, it is now clear that this era does not allow for an easy judgment. She brought the world closer together, but she often did so through coercion. It opened horizons, but it also created wounds. It was a time of great human possibilities and great human guilt. This is precisely where their lasting significance lies. The Age of Discovery reminds us that history is not only about triumphs, but always about costs. It shows how closely greatness and cruelty, knowledge and arrogance, construction and destruction can be connected. Whoever really wants to understand this epoch must therefore learn to see the light without being blinded by the shadow, and to name the shadow without denying the light. Only then will a picture emerge that really comes close to historical truth. Chapter 15, Conclusion: Why this era is still important today. The Age of Discovery dates back several centuries, and yet it is still surprisingly close today. What began on the oceans between the 15th and 17th centuries has not only changed the world for a historical moment, but has created structures that reach into the present day. This is precisely why the study of this epoch does not end with the names of great seafarers, maps, ships, and trade routes. Its real meaning only becomes fully apparent when one asks what remains of it. Why does this time still concern us today? Why is it constantly being retold, criticized, and interpreted? And why is it one of the decisive epochs in world history? The answer to this lies in the fact that the Age of Discovery reconnected the world in a way that touches almost every area of our lives to this day. One of the most important consequences of this epoch is the emergence of a globally networked world. Although trade relations between Europe, Asia, and Africa already existed before the great voyages of discovery, it was not until the new sea routes that the continents were permanently connected in a common system. America entered into these relationships. Oceans became transport routes, and goods, people, ideas, plants, and diseases moved across the earth on an unprecedented scale. This is precisely a central cause of what we know today as globalization. Of course, the modern world with airplanes, the internet, and global financial markets is far more complex than the world of the 16th century. But its historical roots lie in the moment when people began to experience the earth as a coherent space of economic, political, and cultural relations. If today we consume products from different continents as a matter of course, if world markets react to each other, if societies are culturally strongly intertwined, then we live in a world whose foundations were laid in the Age of Discovery. The exchange of plants alone shows this in an impressive way. Potatoes, corn, tomatoes, cocoa, and many other products that are now an integral part of everyday life were only widely used through the global connection of the continents. Animals, raw materials, and cultivation methods also changed entire landscapes and diets. This means that even on our plates we still encounter the consequences of this epoch today. It has reshaped the world not only politically, but very concretely in everyday life. The enduring importance becomes even clearer when one looks at the economy and power. The Age of Discovery was the beginning of a global economy in which wealth was increasingly produced and distributed globally. Silver from America, spices from Asia, enslaved people from Africa, and consumer goods for Europe became part of a system that connected continents. This system created enormous growth and unimagined profits, but it did so under conditions of extreme inequality. Even then, a pattern emerged that we still encounter today. Wealth is often concentrated where power is exercised over trade routes, resources, and labor, while other regions suffer from exploitation, dependence, and heteronomy. If you want to understand the economic inequality of the modern world, you will quickly come across colonial structures whose beginnings date back to the Age of Discovery. This is precisely one of the decisive reasons why this epoch is still important today. It explains not only how Europe was able to build its global power, but also why many other regions have been pushed into asymmetrical relations. The wealth of European states grew not only through industriousness, innovation, or courageous seafaring, but to a considerable extent through colonial rule, exploitation of raw materials, and slave trade. At the same time, societies in America, Africa, and parts of Asia were integrated into the world economy in such a way that their development was determined by external interests. Many of the inequalities of the present are therefore not just random differences, but historical consequences of a system that took shape in this epoch. Today's political world also bears clear traces of the Age of Discovery. Colonial empires that emerged from the voyages of discovery formed borders, states, and power relations that had an impact far beyond their actual existence. In America, new political spaces emerged on the ruins of indigenous empires and societies. In Africa and Asia, European powers increasingly intervened in existing structures, created dependencies, and prepared for later colonial rule. The modern world of states is therefore hardly conceivable without the expansion of Europe. Many conflicts over land, identity, language, and political affiliation are directly or indirectly related to this history. The Age of Discovery was therefore not only a phase of travel, but an epoch in which the political order of the world was prepared anew. Particularly important is the lasting importance of this period for the understanding of colonialism. The Age of Discoveries was not in all respects the fully developed colonial age of later centuries, but it laid its intellectual, economic, and military foundations. During this time, the idea arose that European powers had the right or even the duty to rule foreign territories, to proselytize other peoples and to use their resources for their own power. A way of thinking developed that not only observed differences between cultures, but evaluated them hierarchically. Encounter became superiority, strangeness became subordination. This colonial way of thinking has left deep marks. It continues to have an impact today in forms of racism, cultural devaluation, and global power imbalances. This is precisely why the Age of Discovery is of central importance for today's debates about memory and justice. In many countries, people are now rethinking how to tell this era. For a long time, explorers and conquerors were portrayed primarily as heroes. Their journeys were considered a sign of courage, progress, and human greatness. Today it is more visible that this story must also be told from the perspective of the subjugated, enslaved, and dispossessed. This not only changes the tone of historical representation, but also the view of history as a whole. It's no longer just about who discovered something, but also about who paid the price for it. This change in historical consciousness is itself a sign of how alive and contested the legacy of the Age of Discovery still is. Even for indigenous communities, this epoch is still not the past in the closed sense. Many of them are still fighting for land rights, cultural recognition, political participation, and the preservation of their languages and traditions. The losses associated with conquest, disease, missionary work, and expropriation continue to have an impact in many regions to this day. This applies not only to Latin America, but also to North America and other parts of the world where indigenous populations were affected by colonial expansion. Anyone who wants to understand their current situation must know the history of the Age of Discovery. It is not only about memory, but about continuing historical reality. At the same time, the epoch is still important today because it shows how closely knowledge and power can be connected. The voyages of discovery enormously expanded Europe's geographical and natural history knowledge. Maps were described more precisely, new plants and animals were described, and the globe could be experienced as a contiguous space. But this knowledge was never completely neutral. It also served to control spaces, secure trade routes, and legitimize rule. Maps made coasts not only visible, but also available. Travelogues aroused not only curiosity, but also claims to ownership. Knowledge of nature not only helped with understanding, but often also with exploitation. This intertwining of knowledge and power is still an important topic today. The Age of Discovery teaches us that knowledge does not arise outside of political interests, but is often closely intertwined with them. At the same time, this epoch reminds us of the opportunities and risks of cultural encounters. With the long journeys, people from very different worlds met each other. This gave rise to new mixed cultures, new forms of religious practice, new languages, new ways of life, and new horizons of thought. Encounters thus led not only to conflict and oppression, but also to exchange, adaptation, and creative reformations. Many cultures as we know them today are products of such historical entanglements. Nevertheless, the Age of Discovery also shows how quickly encounter can turn into domination when power is unevenly distributed. This experience is highly topical. Even in the present, contact between cultures is never only enriching, but can be accompanied by inequality, prejudice, and dominance. The epoch therefore holds up a mirror to us. It shows what cultural openness can enable, but also how destructive it becomes when it is combined with arrogance. Another reason for the lasting significance of this period is that it shaped our modern understanding of world history. Before the Age of Discovery, history could be told more regionally. After that, it became increasingly clear that the history of one continent can no longer be understood without the history of other continents. Europe, Africa, Asia, and America became part of a common process, even if participation was very unequal and often violent. Since then, world history has really become world history in a deeper sense. Decisions in a region could have an impact on distant areas. Trade, disease, wars, and political changes crossed oceans. It is precisely this thinking in global contexts that is taken for granted today, but had a decisive historical origin in the developments of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Age of Discovery is also important to this day because it asks us a fundamental question: how do we want to talk about progress? This era was undoubtedly a time of great change, technical achievement, and historical dynamism. But at the same time, it shows that progress is not automatically morally good. People can broaden horizons and at the same time disenfranchise others. They can increase knowledge and legitimize violence at the same time. They can create new connections and still leave deep wounds. This is perhaps one of the most important lessons of this story. It forces us not to naively admire progress, but to always ask about its costs. This question is still relevant today, far beyond the historical era. Especially in a present that is itself characterized by globalization, migration, cultural encounters, and power conflicts, the Age of Discovery can teach us a lot. It shows how quickly economic interests are combined with moral justifications. It shows how seductive the idea of dominating the foreign in the name of progress can be. And it shows how deeply historical injustices can have an impact on the present. Anyone who takes this epoch seriously therefore learns not only about the past, but also about the present. This makes it more than a closed chapter of history. It is a mirror in which we can see the origins of many of today's problems and opportunities. Of course, the Age of Discovery was not the only cause of the modern world. Many other developments, such as the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, or scientific upheavals of later centuries, were also decisive. But the Age of Discovery was a beginning. It was the moment when the Earth became a cohesive space of exchange, competition, and domination for Europe, and increasingly for other regions as well. It was the beginning of a world in which local events could have global consequences. And it was the starting point of a development that connected the planet more closely than had ever been the case before. So if we ask at the end of this journey why this epoch is still important today, the answer is, because it helped shape our world in its basic lines. It has determined how continents relate to each other, how economic areas are created, how cultures meet, how power spreads, and how inequality arises historically. It has increased knowledge and spread violence. It has opened horizons and inflicted wounds. It is therefore not a mere prehistory, but a part of our present. The conclusion of this topic is therefore complex. The Age of Discovery was not just a glorious era of heroic adventures, nor was it just a story of oppression and destruction. It was both at the same time. It is precisely this contradiction that makes it so significant. It condenses central questions of human history. How do people deal with the unknown? How do curiosity and power connect? How do global relationships develop? And who bears the costs of historical upheavals? Perhaps this is precisely the most important lasting lesson of this era. It reminds us that history is never just progress or guilt, but almost always both at the same time. It shows how closely knowledge and domination, exchange and violence, connection and inequality can be intertwined. And it challenges us to take a closer look when we talk about great historical achievements. Because behind every new route, every map, and every discovery, there are also people whose lives have been changed as a result. So the Age of Discovery does not simply end with the last chapter of a history book. It lives on in our language, in our cities, in our trade relations, in political conflicts, in cultural hybrids, and in the open questions of justice and memory. Precisely for this reason, it remains an epoch that we not only know, but must understand.